Welcome, weary traveler. Find a comfortable place to rest. Let your shoulders drop, your breathing slow, and your mind settle like dust on an ancient Roman road. Tonight, we journey together through the vast expanse of the Roman Empire, where marble columns reached toward the heavens and the echo of sandaled feet filled bustling forums. There is no need to remember everything. In fact, there's no need to stay awake at all. Let these stories wash over you like warm Mediterranean waves against a sunlit shore. If you drift away before our journey ends, that's exactly as it should be. The Empire waited centuries to share its secrets. They'll be here when you return. For now, simply breathe and let us begin. Fact 1. The founding of Rome is traditionally dated to April 21st, 753 BCE, when Romulus is said to have marked out the city's sacred boundary with a plow. This act, more ritual than construction, established the Pomerium, the spiritual edge of the city where the urban world met the wild. Imagine that spring morning, the soil rich and dark, turned by bronze as the sun climbed over 7 hills. Those hills would become the heart of everything: Palatine, Capitoline, Aventine, Celian, Esquiline, Viminal, and Quirinal. Each had its own character, its own temples, its own whispers of history. The early Romans believed their city was chosen by the gods, blessed by Jupiter himself, and perhaps that belief alone was enough to make it true. They built their homes of timber and thatch, their shrines of river stone, never imagining that this small settlement would one day cast its shadow across 3 continents. Fact 2. The Roman Republic, which replaced the monarchy in 509 BCE, was governed by 2 consuls who shared power equally and served for just 1 year. This elegant system of dual leadership meant that no single person could hold the reins of state for long, and each consul could veto the other's decisions. Picture these men, always men in those early centuries, standing in their white togas trimmed with purple, balancing ambition with cooperation, knowing that their year would pass quickly and their successor might be their rival. They commanded armies, convened the Senate, and enforced the law, but always together, always watched. This structure, born from the Romans' deep fear of kings after expelling their last monarch, became the foundation of their government for nearly 500 years. The word consul itself comes from the Latin consulere, meaning to consult or to deliberate. And in that meaning we find the heart of what they valued: discussion, debate, shared wisdom. Fact 3. Roman roads, those legendary ribbons of stone that connected the empire, were engineered with such precision that many still exist today, nearly 2,000 years later. The Via Appia, the Queen of Roads, was begun in 312 BCE by the censor Appius Claudius Caecus, stretching from Rome's southeast to Capua and eventually to Brundisium on the Adriatic coast. These roads were built in layers: large stones for the foundation, smaller stones and gravel for stability, then fitted paving stones on top, slightly crowned in the center so rainwater would flow to drainage ditches on either side. Walk along one in your mind now. Feel the smooth, worn stones beneath your feet, warmed by the Italian sun, and imagine the merchants with their laden carts, the soldiers marching in formation, the messengers galloping through dust at dawn. The roads carried not just people and goods but ideas, languages, gods, and dreams across mountains and rivers, binding the empire together like veins in a living body. Fact 4. The Roman legion, the empire's most formidable military unit, typically consisted of about 5,000 heavily armed infantry soldiers organized into centuries and cohorts with extraordinary discipline. Each legionary carried a gladius, a short, double-edged sword perfect for close combat, along with 2 pila, weighted javelins designed to bend on impact so enemies couldn't throw them back. They wore segmented armor called larica segmentata, metal strips that flexed with their movements, and rectangular shields called scutum that could interlock to form a testudo, or tortoise formation, an impenetrable shell of wood and iron. These men trained relentlessly, marching 20 miles in full gear, building fortified camps each night even on campaign, their lives governed by strict routine and absolute obedience. Yet they were more than warriors. They built roads and bridges, aqueducts and walls, and when their 25 years of service ended, they retired with land grants, becoming farmers and fathers, spreading Roman culture to the furthest edges of the known world. Fact 5. The Roman practice of adopting heirs, rather than strictly following bloodlines, allowed the empire to avoid many of the succession crises that plagued other civilizations. A man could choose his successor based on merit, ability, and character rather than the accident of birth. The Emperor Nerva adopted Trajan, who adopted Hadrian, who adopted Antoninus Pius, who adopted Marcus Aurelius in turn. This period, from 96 to 180 CE, is known as the era of the Five Good Emperors, a golden age of relative peace and prosperity. The emperors themselves came from different backgrounds. Trajan was born in Hispania, far from Rome itself, yet each proved capable and conscientious. When Marcus Aurelius broke this pattern by allowing his biological son Commodus to succeed him, the empire's fortunes darkened, and many historians mark this moment as the beginning of Rome's long, slow transformation. But for nearly a century, adoption gave Rome something precious: continuity of wisdom, passed from one generation to the next like a carefully tended flame. Fact 6. Aqueducts, those magnificent arched structures that still grace the landscapes of former Roman territories, carried fresh water from mountain springs to thirsty cities across the empire. Rome itself was served by 11 major aqueducts by the late imperial period, delivering hundreds of millions of gallons daily. The water flowed by gravity alone. No pumps, no machinery, just careful engineering and patient calculation of slope and distance. The Aqua Claudia, completed by Emperor Claudius in 52 CE, stretched 45 miles, much of it underground or on low walls, but where it crossed the Roman Campagna it rose on towering arcades of stone that seemed to stride across the landscape like the legs of giants. The water-filled public fountains where citizens gathered to gossip and fill their vessels, fed the grand bathhouses where Romans spent their afternoons, and supplied the Naumachii, artificial lakes where staged naval battles entertained thousands. Clean water, delivered reliably and abundantly, was one of Rome's greatest gifts to its people, a gift that spoke of power, organization, and care. Fact 7. The Roman Senate, originally an advisory council of elder statesmen, evolved over centuries from a group of patrician families into a more representative body that included wealthy plebeians as well. Senators wore togas with a broad purple stripe, the latus clavus, distinguishing them from ordinary citizens, and they gathered in the Curia Julia, a building on the Roman Forum with high doors and vaulted ceilings where their voices echoed during debates. Though the Senate's power waned under the emperors, becoming more ceremonial than decisive, it remained the symbolic heart of Roman government, a link to the Republic's ideals even as autocracy became reality. These men, for the Senate admitted no women, represented continuity and tradition, accumulated wealth and ancient names. They advised, they deliberated, they issued decrees that were recorded on bronze tablets and posted for all to see. In their hands, for good or ill, rested the memory of what Rome had been and the image of what it claimed still to be. Fact 8. The Colosseum, properly called the Flavian Amphitheater, could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators who entered and exited through 80 numbered archways in a system so efficient that the entire building could be emptied in mere minutes. Construction began under Emperor Vespasian around 72 CE and was completed by his son Titus in 80 CE, funded largely by treasures plundered from Jerusalem after the Jewish War. The building stood on the site of Nero's opulent palace, symbolically returning land to the people that the mad emperor had claimed for himself. Its walls rose 4 stories high, each level decorated in a different architectural order: Doric, then Ionic, then Corinthian, a lesson in classical design. Beneath the wooden arena floor lay the hypogeum, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers where gladiators waited, wild animals paced in cages, and elaborate mechanical systems could raise fighters and beasts on platforms to surprise the crowd. The Colosseum was theater, spectacle, and political tool all at once, offering free entertainment to keep the populace satisfied and loyal. Even today, weathered by earthquakes and stone robbers, it stands, honey-colored in the Roman sun, a monument to both human achievement and human cruelty. Fact 9. Roman bathhouses, or thermae, were far more than places to wash. They were social centers where Romans of all classes mingled, relaxed, conducted business, and exercised. The largest, like the baths of Caracalla completed in 216 CE, covered acres and could accommodate thousands at once. A visitor would begin in the apodyterium, the changing room, then move through a progression of increasingly warm chambers, the tepidarium with its pleasant moderate heat, then the caldarium, steaming and hot, where slaves would scrape clean your skin with curved metal tools called strigils since soap was barely known. Afterward, one might plunge into the frigidarium, a cold pool to close the pores and invigorate the body. The baths were heated by a hypocaust system, hollow spaces beneath the floors where hot air from furnaces circulated, warming the tiles from below until they were almost too hot to walk upon. Around the bathing areas were libraries, gardens, exercise yards, and rooms for massage and grooming. For a small fee, or sometimes for free on days sponsored by wealthy patrons, anyone could enter and spend hours in comfort and conversation, their social distinctions temporarily dissolved in the democratic embrace of warm water. That's the first section, 9 facts woven together, like threads in an ancient tapestry. Let those images settle gently in your mind. Roads stretching to horizons, senators debating in marble halls, water flowing through stone channels. And breathe deeply, letting the empire's long history hold you. Fact 10. The Roman calendar, reformed by Julius Caesar in 46 BCE, gave us the structure we still use today with 12 months and 365 days, plus one extra day every 4 years. Before Caesar's reform, the Roman year had fallen badly out of sync with the seasons, causing confusion and making it difficult to plan festivals, agricultural work, and military campaigns. Caesar, advised by the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, created the Julian calendar with months of varying lengths, 30 or 31 days, except for February with 28, gaining one more in leap years. He named the month of his birth, previously called Quintilis, Julius in his own honor, what we now call July. His successor Augustus later took the next month, August, ensuring his own memory would march through time eternal. This gift of temporal order, this fixing of days to seasons, was as important as any military conquest, for it allowed the empire to coordinate across vast distances, to know when taxes were due, when harvest should begin, when religious festivals should be observed. Time itself became Roman. Fact 11. Pompeii, that city frozen in time, was buried under volcanic ash when Mount Vesuvius erupted on August 24 in 79 CE. The eruption came in 2 phases. First, a column of ash and pumice shot miles into the sky, raining down on the city for hours while panicked residents debated whether to flee or shelter in place. Then came the pyroclastic surges, superheated avalanches of gas and volcanic matter that swept down the mountain at hurricane speed, killing instantly anyone still in the city and covering everything in a thick, preserving blanket. When archaeologists began excavating Pompeii centuries later, they found a city perfectly preserved, down to loaves of bread in ovens, political slogans painted on walls, and gardens where the roots of plants left voids in the hardened ash. They found the shapes of bodies too, people caught in their final moments, and by pouring plaster into these hollow spaces, they captured the postures of death and terror and resignation. Walking through Pompeii's ruins today, you see not grand monuments but ordinary life. The grooves worn in street stones by cartwheels, the small household shrines where families prayed to their gods, the graffiti on tavern walls. The tragedy gave us an invaluable gift, a glimpse of daily Roman existence, unfiltered and true. Fact 12. The Roman concept of citizenship evolved dramatically over the empire's history, eventually extending from a privilege of birth in the city itself to a status granted across the Mediterranean world. In the early Republic, only free men born in Rome to Roman parents could claim citizenship with all its rights and protections. But as Rome's territory expanded, citizenship became a tool of integration and reward. Entire allied communities might be granted citizenship for loyalty or service. Soldiers from the provinces, upon completing their military service, received citizenship for themselves and their families. Finally, in 212 CE, Emperor Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, extending Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. This wasn't pure generosity. It expanded the tax base and simplified administration, but it also created something unprecedented: a shared legal identity across cultures, languages, and traditions. A merchant in Britannia, a farmer in Egypt, and a scholar in Syria could all claim civis Romanus sum. I am a Roman citizen, and with those words came protection under Roman law, the right to appeal to the emperor, and a connection to something greater than their hometown or tribe. Fact 13. Gladiatorial games, though often depicted as simple blood sport, were complex performances rooted in religious ritual and social meaning. The earliest gladiatorial combats were actually funeral rites, private ceremonies where warriors fought to the death to honor deceased nobles, their blood considered an offering to the spirits of the underworld. Over time, these intimate rituals transformed into massive public spectacles, but they retained their connection to death and commemoration. Gladiators were mostly slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals, though some were free volunteers seeking fame and fortune. They trained in special schools, the Ludi, learning different fighting styles, the Murmillo with his large shield and helmet with a fish crest, the Retiarius with his net and trident, the Thraex with his small shield and curved sword. Successful gladiators became celebrities, their names inscribed on pottery and walls, their images sold as decorative lamps. Yet their lives were precarious, dependent on the crowd's mercy and the editors, the game's sponsors' final decision, symbolized by the famous thumbs up or down. Some won their freedom, receiving a wooden sword called a rudis, but most died young, buried in special cemeteries outside the city walls where their tombstones recorded their fights, their victories, and their years. Let yourself drift now, if you need to. The Empire's stories will continue, steady as the stars that Roman sailors used to navigate dark seas. Fact 14. Roman concrete, or opus cementitium, was a revolutionary building material that allowed the construction of domes, vaults, and structures of unprecedented size and durability. The formula mixed lime mortar with volcanic ash, particularly pozzolana from the area around Mount Vesuvius, along with chunks of rock or broken brick. This combination, when set, created something stronger than the sum of its parts, and unlike Greek construction which relied on precisely cut stones stacked without mortar, Roman concrete could be poured into wooden forms, allowing for curved surfaces and complex shapes. The Pantheon's Great Dome, completed under Hadrian around 125 CE, remains the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome even today. A perfect hemisphere with an oculus, a circular opening at the top that lets in a moving shaft of sunlight like the finger of a god. Roman concrete also set underwater, enabling the construction of harbor installations and bridges. Modern scientists studying ancient Roman harbors have discovered that the seawater actually strengthened the concrete over time, causing minerals to crystallize within it, a trick we've only recently begun to understand. These builders, working without modern tools or calculations, achieved what we can barely replicate, their structures standing firm while empires rose and fell around them. Fact 15. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, describes the roughly 200 years from the reign of Augustus beginning in 27 BCE to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, when the empire experienced relative stability, minimal expansion, and flourishing trade and culture. This wasn't perfect peace. There were still border conflicts, occasional rebellions, and political intrigues, but compared to the chaos that came before and after, it was a remarkable achievement. Roads were safe enough for merchants to travel long distances with valuable goods. Ships crossed the Mediterranean without fear of pirates, their holds full of grain from Egypt, olive oil from Hispania, wine from Gaul, silk that had journeyed all the way from distant China. Cities grew wealthy and built forums, temples, theaters, and libraries. Literature flourished in the works of Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and later, Tacitus and Juvenal. Philosophy schools in Athens and elsewhere debated Stoicism and Epicureanism. For an ordinary person living in this era, the empire must have seemed eternal, divinely ordained, the natural order of the world. They couldn't know that peace is always temporary, that the forces of change were already gathering at the frontiers and within. Fact 16. Roman women, especially those of the upper classes, had more freedom and legal rights than women in many other ancient societies, though they still lived within a patriarchal structure. They could own property, inherit wealth, conduct business, and in later imperial periods, initiate divorce. Elite women like Livia, wife of Augustus, and Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, wielded considerable political influence, though always behind the scenes since women could not hold office or vote. Wealthy women managed large households, educated their children, sometimes to remarkably high standards, and hosted gatherings where poetry was recited and philosophy discussed. Lower-class women worked alongside men in shops, workshops, and fields, their labor essential to family survival even if rarely recorded or celebrated. We know their names from tombstones and legal documents. Aminta the midwife, Claudia the wool seller, Julia the tavern keeper. Some women became doctors, though this was unusual and often viewed with suspicion. Others became priestesses, particularly the Vestal virgins who tended the sacred flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, in Rome's Forum. These 6 women, chosen as children from aristocratic families, served for 30 years under vows of chastity, their purity believed essential to Rome's safety. They enjoyed legal privileges, special seating at events, and the power to pardon condemned prisoners they encountered in the street, yet if they broke their vows, they were buried alive. Fact 17. Latin, the language of Rome, spread throughout the empire and evolved into the Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, that are spoken by hundreds of millions today. But Latin itself existed in 2 forms. Classical Latin, the refined language of literature, law, and formal speech, and vulgar Latin, the everyday speech of common people, soldiers, and merchants. It was vulgar Latin, flexible and constantly changing, that carried across the empire's provinces and transformed over centuries into the modern tongues. Classical Latin was the language of Cicero's orations, Caesar's commentaries, Virgil's poetry, precise, elegant, governed by complex rules of grammar and case. But in the markets of Londinium or the wine shops of Burdigala, people spoke a Latin that was looser, that borrowed freely from local languages, that shifted verb conjugations and simplified noun declensions. This spoken Latin is harder to reconstruct because humble people rarely wrote things down, but we catch glimpses in soldiers' letters, merchants' receipts, cursed tablets people buried hoping to hex their enemies. The language was alive, breathing, adapting, and in that adaptability lay its power and its future. Fact 18. The Roman villa was both farm and fortress, workshop and retreat, a self-sufficient estate that dominated the countryside. The grandest villas belonged to senators and wealthy equites who fled Rome's summer heat for their country properties. These estates sprawled across hillsides with the Villa Urbana, the owner's elegant residence, at the center, decorated with frescoes, mosaics, and statuary, built around courtyards where fountains played and rose gardens bloomed. Surrounding this were the Villa Rustica, the working farm with quarters for slaves and hired workers, storage buildings for grain and wine, workshops for making pottery or weaving cloth, olive presses and grain mills, stables and animal pens. The villa aimed for autarky, producing everything its residents needed: food, cloth, tools, with surplus sold in nearby towns. Some villas in Gaul or Britannia included defensive walls and towers as protection against raids, while those in peaceful Italy might sprawl carelessly across the landscape, confident in the empire's protection. Archaeologists excavating villa sites find traces of extraordinary comfort: underfloor heating in northern climates, elaborate bathhouses, libraries of scrolls, tableware imported from across the empire. Yet these were working estates, and most people living there labored from dawn to dusk, tending vines, harvesting olives, herding sheep across rocky pastures. Breathe deeply now. The empire's complexity need not weigh on you. Just let these pictures form and fade. Villas in sunlight, languages transforming, women managing their households with quiet competence. Fact 19. Trajan's Column, erected in 113 CE to commemorate the emperor's victory in the Dacian Wars, stands 125 feet tall in Rome's Forum, wrapped in a continuous spiral frieze that tells the story of the campaigns in exquisite detail. 2,300 individual figures march around the column in 155 scenes, from the Roman legions crossing the Danube River on a bridge of boats to the final defeat of the Dacian king Decebalus. The column was originally topped with a statue of Trajan himself, later replaced with one of St. Peter. Inside the column, a spiral staircase of 185 steps winds upward to a viewing platform, and at the base, there was originally a chamber holding a golden urn containing Trajan's ashes. The reliefs tell us so much about Roman military life. We see soldiers building fortifications, bridges, and roads. We see them in battle, treating their wounded, offering sacrifices to the gods. We see Dacian warriors with their distinctive curved swords, their fortifications in timber and stone. The column was originally brightly painted, and standing at its base looking up must have been overwhelming. A complete narrative spiraling toward the heavens, visible proof of Roman power and organizational genius. It still stands today, barely weathered by 19 centuries, Trajan's legacy carved in enduring stone. Fact 20. The Roman postal system, the cursus publicus, was established by Augustus to ensure rapid communication across the empire's vast distances. Relay stations were positioned along major roads at intervals of roughly 8 to 12 miles, each stocked with fresh horses and mules, lodging, and food. Official couriers carrying the emperor's seal could change mounts without delay and continue immediately, covering up to 50 miles per day or more if the message was urgent. This system was reserved for government business: military dispatches, imperial edicts, reports from provincial governors. But it meant that news from the frontiers could reach Rome in days rather than weeks. For private correspondence, people relied on personal slaves, friends traveling in the right direction, or commercial messengers who carried letters and small packages for a fee. Letters were written on thin sheets of papyrus or wax tablets for quick notes, sealed with wax and stamped with the sender's signet ring. Reading surviving letters, and thousands have been preserved, everything from official reports to birthday party invitations, we discover how similar people's concerns were to our own. Family worries, business anxieties, requests for money or favors, expressions of love and frustration. The empire was bound together not just by roads and armies, but by this constant flow of words, carrying information, emotion, and human connection. Fact 21. The cult of Mithras, a mystery religion that became popular in the Roman Empire, especially among soldiers, centered on the god Mithras slaying a cosmic bull, an act of sacrifice that brought life and order to the world. Mithraism was secretive, initiates progressing through 7 grades of membership from raven to father, each with its own rituals, ordeals, and privileges. Mithraists met in underground temples called Mithraea, usually small, cave-like structures that could accommodate maybe 20 or 30 people. In the center of each Mithraeum stood the Tauroctony, The cult image showing Mithras in his Persian cap driving a knife into the bull's shoulder while a dog, serpent, and scorpion attack the beast, and wheat springs from its wound. A scene loaded with astrological symbolism scholars still debate. Unlike Christianity, which it partially overlapped chronologically, Mithraism excluded women entirely, making it particularly appealing to military men seeking brotherhood and belonging far from home. The religion spread along the legion's routes, and Mithraea have been found from Britannia to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine frontier to North Africa. When Christianity eventually triumphed, many Mithraea were deliberately destroyed or buried, which ironically preserved them for archaeologists to discover later, their painted walls and stone reliefs still conveying a mystery we can only partially penetrate. Fact 22. Roman engineering achieved one of its greatest triumphs in the amphitheater at Nîmes in southern Gaul, a structure so well preserved that it's still used for events 2,000 years after its construction around 70 CE. This arena could seat 20,000 spectators on tiered stone benches, divided by social class. The elite in the lower sections closest to the action, common folk higher up, and slaves and women in the topmost rows under the sun. The arena floor, 69 meters long, saw gladiatorial combats and animal hunts, though it was too small for the elaborate naval battles staged in larger venues. What makes the Nîmes amphitheater remarkable is how Romans adapted their architectural knowledge to local conditions. It's built entirely of precisely cut stone blocks fitted together without mortar, each block weighing up to 2 tons, creating a self-supporting structure of such integrity that earthquakes and wars barely damaged it. After the empire fell, the building served new purposes: a fortress during the Middle Ages, a neighborhood with houses built inside during later centuries, before being cleared and restored. Walking its corridors now, you follow the same paths Roman spectators climbed, your feet on stones worn smooth by uncounted thousands, the air still somehow electric with the echoes of roared approval and desperate combat. Fact 23. The Roman system of clientela and patronage structured social relationships across the empire in ways that seem strange to modern eyes. A patron was typically a wealthy or politically powerful man who provided support, legal assistance, financial help, and opportunities to his clients, people of lower status who depended on him. In return, clients owed their patron respect, loyalty, votes if he ran for office, and attendance at his morning salutatio, the ritual greeting where clients would come to their patron's home and escort him to the forum. This wasn't friendship between equals, but a hierarchical relationship embedded in mutual obligation, both sides benefiting in a society without social safety nets. A patron might have dozens or hundreds of clients, and he in turn might be client to someone even more powerful. The system extended beyond individual relationships to entire cities or provinces that became clients of Rome, maintaining their self-governance in exchange for loyalty, tribute, and military support. This web of obligations held society together, providing stability and order, though it also reinforced inequality and made everything personal. There was little sense of abstract justice or neutral bureaucracy, only networks of human relationships, some generous, some exploitative, most somewhere in between. Let these facts wash over you like gentle waves. There's no need to grasp or remember. Just rest in the knowledge that these lives were lived, these stones were laid, these relationships shaped a world. Fact 24. Hadrian's Wall, built beginning in 122 CE across northern Britannia, stretched 73 miles from coast to coast, marking the northernmost permanent frontier of the Roman Empire. It wasn't just a wall, it was a complex defensive system with a stone barrier up to 15 feet high and 10 feet thick, punctuated every Roman mile by a fortified gateway mile castle housing 40 or so soldiers, and between each mile castle, 2 observation turrets. Behind the wall ran a military road for rapid troop movement, and larger forts at strategic intervals housed auxiliary cohorts, soldiers recruited from across the empire who spent decades on this remote frontier far from their homelands. Archaeologists have found letters written on thin wooden tablets at the fort of Indolanda, just behind the wall, A treasure trove of everyday Roman life, including birthday party invitations, requests for beer and socks, duty rosters, intelligence reports on native tribes. The wall marked not just a military boundary but a cultural one, with Romanized life to the south. Towns, villas, temples, bathhouses, and the lands of unconquered Caledonia to the north. Yet the boundary was always permeable. Traders crossed to exchange goods, families split by the wall maintained connections, and auxiliary soldiers recruited from northern tribes helped man the very wall that separated them from their relatives. Standing on the wall today, looking north across rolling hills and moorlands, you can almost feel the weight of empire, the loneliness of soldiers posted at the edge of the known world, keeping watch for threats that sometimes came and sometimes didn't, year after year, decade after decade. Fact 25. Roman medicine combined practical experience, Greek medical theory, and a fair amount of superstition and error. Army doctors, medici, became remarkably skilled at treating wounds, setting broken bones, and performing surgery, with archaeological evidence showing specialized medical instruments, scalpels, forceps, bone drills, specula, of surprising sophistication. The most famous Roman doctor, Galen, who lived in the 2nd century CE, wrote extensively on anatomy and physiology, although much of his understanding was flawed by reliance on animal dissection rather than human, since Roman custom prohibited autopsy. Still, Galen's authority in medicine lasted over 1,000 years. Romans understood some basic principles of public health, hence their investment in clean water, sewage systems, and bathhouses. But their medical theory was based on the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, that supposedly needed balancing. Treatments ranged from the sensible, like rest and bland diet for digestive troubles, to the alarming, like bloodletting for almost any serious illness. People also turned to religious healing, visiting temples of Asclepius where they'd sleep in hopes the god would send healing dreams, or wearing amulets inscribed with magical words. Life expectancy was low by our standards. Childhood mortality was heartbreakingly high, and even small infections could prove fatal. Yet Romans treated their illnesses with the knowledge they had, and the best doctors combined observation, experience, and genuine care for their patients, earning respect and sometimes lasting fame. Fact 26. The Roman Forum, the heart of civic and religious life in the capital, began as a marshy valley between hills that was drained and paved in the 6th century BCE and evolved over centuries into a crowded complex of temples, basilicas, monuments, and public spaces. Walking through the Forum in its glory days meant navigating crowds, senators in their purple-striped togas, merchants hawking goods, lawyers arguing cases in the basilicas, priests conducting ceremonies at temple altars, tourists from distant provinces gawking at famous monuments, pickpockets and beggars working the crowd. Temples rose on every side, Saturn with his treasury, Castor and Pollux with their towering columns, Vesta where the sacred flame burned eternal. The Curia housed the Senate. The rostra served as a speaker's platform decorated with the bronze rams of captured ships, and throughout the space stood honorary columns, triumphal arches, and equestrian statues commemorating great men and victories. The Forum was less a planned space than an accumulation of centuries, each generation adding to what came before until the area became almost cluttered with memory and meaning. After the empire's fall, the Forum became a cow pasture, its monuments buried under meters of soil and debris, its true level sinking while the modern city rose above. Excavations over the past few centuries have revealed its grandeur again, though what you see today is fragmentary. Enough columns and walls to sketch the shape of what was, but requiring imagination to restore the noise, the color, the overwhelming sense of being at the center of the world. Fact 27. The Roman triumph was the highest honor a victorious general could receive, a single day of glory when he entered Rome in ceremonial procession, riding in a chariot painted gold, wearing the purple and gold toga of Jupiter himself, his face painted red in the god's image. The procession wound through the city from the Campus Martius through the Forum to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus on the Capitoline Hill, and included the conquering army, captives in chains, carts laden with spoils of war, musicians, priests leading sacrificial animals, and senators walking in formal dignity. The triumphator held a laurel branch and a scepter, and behind him stood a slave whose duty was to whisper repeatedly, "Remember, you are mortal," a reminder that this godlike moment would pass. The triumph celebrated military victory, but also demonstrated Roman power to its own citizens and humiliated conquered enemies, some of whom would be ritually strangled in the Tullianum, Rome's ancient prison, when the procession ended. Not every victory earned a triumph. The Senate decided, based on strict criteria including the number of enemy killed and whether Rome had been under serious threat. Generals sometimes manipulated casualty figures or overstated dangers to qualify. So hungry were they for this ultimate recognition. The triumph was theater, religion, and politics intertwined, a day when Rome reminded itself of its destiny to rule the world. And now, dear traveler, our journey through these 30 minutes of Roman history comes to its gentle close. You've walked alongside legions on stone roads, stood in the forum as senators debated, watched the construction of walls and aqueducts, felt the heat of bathhouses and the cool spray of fountains. The empire's vastness is too much for any mind to hold at once, and that's perfectly fine. These stories, these facts, these fragments of 2,000 years ago, they're just whispers now, echoes of lives lived under different skies. If you're still listening, know that you're welcome to return whenever you wish. If you've drifted into sleep, then you've found exactly what you needed. The empire rose and fell, but its traces remain, and in those traces, we find not just history but company. Proof that human beings across time have built, loved, struggled, and dreamed. May you rest well tonight, held safely by the present, enriched perhaps by this glimpse of the past. Sleep now, peaceful and deep. The Roman Empire will be here when you wake, patient as stone, eternal in memory. Good night. Fact 28. The Praetorian Guard, established by Augustus around 27 BCE, served as the emperor's personal bodyguard and the only military unit permanently stationed in Rome itself. These elite soldiers, usually selected from the legions after distinguished service, enjoyed shorter terms of enlistment, 16 years instead of the standard 25, and received substantially higher pay than ordinary legionaries. They wore distinctive uniforms and armor, and their camp, the Castra Praetoria, occupied a prominent position on the city's northeastern edge. But the Praetorians were more than bodyguards. Their proximity to power made them kingmakers, and their loyalty could never be taken for granted. In 41 CE, they assassinated Emperor Caligula and then immediately proclaimed Claudius, his uncle, as emperor, essentially choosing Rome's ruler. This set a dangerous precedent, and over the following centuries, the Guard would make and unmake emperors with disturbing frequency, sometimes auctioning the imperial throne to the highest bidder. In 193 CE, after assassinating Emperor Pertinax, they literally put the empire up for sale, with the wealthy senator Didius Julianus winning the auction by promising each guardsman a massive payment. His reign lasted just 66 days before rivals marched on Rome. The Praetorians were finally disbanded by Constantine in 312 CE after they backed his rival in civil war, their legacy forever tainted by their role in transforming the Principate into something unstable and violent. Fact 29. Ostia, Rome's port city at the mouth of the Tiber River, was the empire's commercial lifeline, where grain ships from Egypt and Africa unloaded their cargo to feed the capital's million inhabitants. Walking through excavated Ostia today, you can still see the remarkable organization of ancient commerce. Warehouses called horia with multiple stories and ventilated walls to keep grain dry, offices of shipping companies decorated with mosaics showing their trade routes and the types of ships they operated, taverns where sailors from across the Mediterranean drank wine and complained about their voyages, apartment blocks called insulae that rose 4 or 5 stories to house workers and their families. The theater, which seated 3,500, overlooked a large public square where merchants gathered. Behind the theater stood the Piazzale del Corporazione, a colonnade surrounding an open space with 61 small rooms, each the office of a different trading company or guild: rope makers, grain measurers, shipbuilders, their mosaic floors advertising their specialties with images of elephants for ivory traders, dolphins for fishing companies, lighthouses for pilot services. Ostia was cosmopolitan in ways Rome itself sometimes wasn't, a place where Syrian merchants worshipped their gods in modest temples, where African grain traders married local women, where the empire's diversity was most visible and most essential to daily survival. Fact 30. The Roman dinner party, or convivium, was an elaborate social ritual for the wealthy, typically beginning in late afternoon and extending well into the night. Guests reclined on couches arranged in a triclinium, a dining room configured to hold 3 couches in a U-shape around a central table. The host, or dominus, carefully selected his guests to ensure compatible conversation, and seating position indicated social rank. The most honored guest reclined at the consul's spot. The meal typically progressed through 3 courses: the gestatio or appetizers featuring eggs, vegetables, and light dishes, the prima mensa or main course with multiple meat and fish dishes, and the secunda mensa or dessert with fruits, nuts, and honey cakes. Between courses, slaves washed guests' hands with scented water, since Romans ate primarily with their fingers, using bread to sop up sauces. Wine flowed freely, always mixed with water in various ratios, and the drinking might continue long after eating ceased, accompanied by entertainment. Musicians playing lyres or flutes, dancers performing, poets reciting verses, or philosophical discussions that could turn heated. The wealthy competed to serve exotic dishes: flamingo tongues, dormice fattened on nuts, fish brought alive in tanks from distant seas, not just for pleasure but to display their wealth and sophistication. Yet even modest households held simpler versions of these dinners, maintaining the essential form: reclining together, sharing food, strengthening the social bonds that held Roman society together. Fact 31. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE destroyed not only Pompeii but also the nearby town of Herculaneum, though in a different manner. While Pompeii was buried under several meters of ash and pumice that fell from the sky, Herculaneum was engulfed by pyroclastic flows, superheated surges of gas and volcanic matter that flash carbonized organic materials, creating an extraordinary archaeological record. At Herculaneum, wooden furniture, food, papyrus scrolls, and even fishing nets survived in carbonized form. The town was wealthier than Pompeii, its houses more elegant, many with multiple stories overlooking the Bay of Naples. In the 1980s, archaeologists excavating the ancient shoreline discovered boat chambers where they found the skeletons of hundreds of people who had fled to the beach hoping for rescue by sea. The physical anthropology of these remains tells heartbreaking stories. Families huddled together, a soldier still wearing his sword belt, a woman clutching her jewelry, their bones showing the instant thermal shock that killed them. Among the most significant finds at Herculaneum was the Villa of the Papyri, a luxury residence containing a library of about 1,800 carbonized papyrus scrolls, many containing Greek philosophical texts otherwise lost to history. Modern technology is slowly, painstakingly unrolling and reading these fragile scrolls, recovering words written 2,000 years ago that survived only because they were burned and buried. Fact 32. Roman concrete's durability has long puzzled modern engineers, who discovered that Roman harbor installations actually grew stronger over time rather than eroding in seawater. Recent research has revealed why. When seawater percolated through the concrete, it dissolved components of the volcanic ash and triggered the growth of rare minerals, particularly a mineral called aluminum tobermarite, which reinforced the material's structure. This process, called pozzolanic reaction, meant that Roman maritime concrete literally healed itself and became more resilient with age. The Romans didn't understand the chemistry, but centuries of experimentation taught them which volcanic deposits produced the best results. They quarried pozzolana from specific sites, mixing it with lime and seawater according to recipes that were likely trade secrets passed from master builder to apprentice. Modern concrete, by contrast, is designed for rapid setting and early strength but begins deteriorating almost immediately, especially in marine environments. The difference in lifespan is staggering. Contemporary reinforced concrete might last 50 to 100 years, while Roman structures have survived 2 millennia and show no signs of imminent failure. We're still learning from their techniques, trying to create more sustainable building materials inspired by ancient wisdom. Fact 33. The Roman system of slavery was fundamental to the empire's economy and deeply woven into every aspect of society, with perhaps a quarter to a third of the population in Italy consisting of enslaved people during the late Republic and early Empire. Slaves worked in mines and on agricultural estates, in workshops and households, as gladiators and as secretaries, as tutors and as prostitutes. Their treatment varied enormously. Household slaves in wealthy families might live relatively comfortable lives with access to education and eventual manumission, while those working in Sicilian grain fields or Spanish silver mines faced brutal conditions and early death. Slavery in Rome wasn't based on race but on the fortune of war and birth. Anyone conquered could be enslaved, and children born to enslaved mothers inherited that status. Yet Roman slavery had features that distinguished it from later systems. Manumission was common, and freed slaves, called liberti, became citizens, though they retained some obligations to their former masters who became their patrons. Some freedmen accumulated enormous wealth and influence, like Trimalchio in Petronius's Satyricon, whose ostentatious dinner parties satirized the pretensions of the newly rich. Still, slavery remained a profound injustice and a source of constant anxiety for slave owners who feared revolt. The most famous uprising, led by the gladiator Spartacus in 73 BCE, saw 70,000 escaped slaves defeat Roman armies repeatedly before finally being crushed. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, their bodies left to hang as a warning, an act of terror meant to prevent future resistance. Fact 34. The Pantheon, whose name means Temple of All Gods, is perhaps Rome's most perfectly preserved ancient building, standing almost exactly as it was completed under Hadrian around 125 CE. The building's genius lies in its perfect proportions. The interior space forms a perfect sphere, with the diameter of the dome exactly equaling the height from floor to oculus. The dome itself, built with graduated layers of concrete mixed with progressively lighter materials, brick and tufa at the base, then volcanic pumice higher up, weighs far less than it appears and distributes its weight onto the massive rotunda walls rather than requiring internal supports. The oculus, the 30-foot wide opening at the dome's crown, is both symbolic and functional, admitting light that moves across the interior as the sun travels, creating a living sundial and connecting the enclosed space to the heavens. On rainy days, water falls through the oculus to drains in the slightly convex floor, an effect that must have seemed magical. The building's original purpose remains somewhat mysterious. Was it truly a temple to all gods, or was it more specifically connected to emperor worship and the deification of Augustus? After the empire's fall, the Pantheon's survival was assured when it was consecrated as a Christian church in 609 CE, protecting it from the systematic destruction that befell many pagan temples. Walking inside today, standing under that great dome with light falling from above, you experience space almost exactly as Romans did 1800 years ago, one of the few places where the ancient world remains completely intact. Breathe easily now. Let these images form without effort. Temples under open skies, slaves and masters living intertwined lives, ships unloading grain at busy docks. The empire contained multitudes, contradictions, both beauty and cruelty. Fact 35. Roman roads didn't simply connect cities. They transformed landscapes and enabled an unprecedented integration of diverse territories. The network eventually included approximately 50,000 miles of paved roads, with perhaps another 200,000 miles of secondary roads and local tracks. Building a road was an engineering feat involving surveying teams using groma and chorobates to establish straight lines and proper gradients, then excavating to bedrock if necessary, laying down multiple carefully graded layers, large foundation stones, then crushed rock and gravel, then carefully fitted paving stones called basalt blocks, each shaped to lock with its neighbors. The finished road surface was cambered to shed water, with curbstones marking the edges and drainage ditches flanking both sides. Every Roman mile, slightly shorter than our modern mile, was marked with a milestone recording the distance to major cities and often the name of the emperor under whom that section was built or restored. These roads served military purposes primarily, allowing legions to march swiftly to threatened frontiers, but they became arteries of commerce, culture, and communication. Merchants' carts and pack animals wore grooves in the stone. Pilgrims traveled to famous temples. Farmers brought produce to market. The roads made the empire feel smaller, more connected, more Roman. Even today, many modern European highways follow routes established by Roman engineers 2 millennia ago, testimony to their skill in choosing routes that made geographical sense. Fact 36. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who reigned from 161 to 180 CE, was also a Stoic philosopher whose personal writings, known as the Meditations, offer remarkable insight into the mind of one of history's most powerful men. These weren't meant for publication but were private reflections, written in Greek, the language of philosophy, during military campaigns along the Danube frontier, where he spent years fighting Germanic tribes. Reading the Meditations, you find not grand pronouncements but reminders to himself about virtue, mortality, duty, and perspective. He reminds himself that everything is transient, that death comes to emperors and slaves alike, that other people's opinions matter little, that he should focus on what's within his control and accept what isn't. There's a melancholy thread running through these reflections, the weariness of a man who would rather be reading philosophy in Rome but instead must govern an empire and command armies. He writes, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Marcus Aurelius embodied the Stoic ideal of duty over inclination, spending his reign responding to crises rather than enjoying power's privileges. Yet he also made what many historians consider a catastrophic mistake by allowing his biological son Commodus to succeed him, breaking the adoptive pattern that had chosen emperors based on merit. Commodus proved to be unstable and cruel, his reign marking the end of the Pax Romana and the beginning of a more troubled age. Fact 37. Roman theater differed significantly from the Greek theater that inspired it, favoring comedy, mime, and spectacle over the philosophical tragedies that dominated Greek stages. The most celebrated Roman dramatist, Plautus, wrote comedies in the 2nd century BCE featuring stock characters: the clever slave, the greedy merchant, the lovesick young man, the strict father, in situations of mistaken identity, disguise, and intrigue. These plays were performed during religious festivals, with actors wearing masks and speaking in verse. Later, more elaborate theatrical forms emerged. Pantomime performances where a single actor, wearing different masks, would perform all roles in a mythological story while musicians and chorus provided accompaniment. And mime, which unlike its modern meaning involved dialogue and often featured scandalous content, with female performers, a rarity in ancient theater. Roman theaters, unlike Greek ones built into hillsides, were freestanding structures of concrete and stone, often with elaborate stage buildings faced with marble columns. The theater of Marcellus in Rome, completed in 13 BCE and holding 11,000 spectators, shows this architectural achievement. 3 tiers of arches in different orders supporting the seating, and a stage building that once soared behind the performance space. Theater-going was social, sometimes raucous. Audiences might shout approval or hurl insults at performers, munch on snacks, and gossip with neighbors. It was democratic entertainment in ways that gladiatorial games weren't. appealing to all classes and offering a release valve for social tensions through comedy that could gently mock the powerful. Fact 38. The Roman province of Egypt occupied a special status within the empire, so important for its grain production that Augustus personally controlled it, not trusting it to a senatorial governor. Egypt supplied Rome with about 1/3 of its grain, and the interruption of this supply could mean riots and political crisis. The grain ships that sailed from Alexandria were among the largest vessels in the ancient world, some capable of carrying 1,000 tons. The journey from Egypt to Rome's port took about 2 weeks with favorable winds, but could take much longer. Roman emperors maintained the Ptolemaic administrative system they inherited when they annexed Egypt in 30 BCE after defeating Antony and Cleopatra, keeping the Greek-speaking bureaucracy and the census system that tracked every person for taxation. Egypt was also a land of fascination for Romans. Exotic, ancient beyond memory, filled with monuments that dwarfed anything in Italy. Wealthy Romans traveled there as tourists, sailing up the Nile to see the pyramids and the Colossus of Memnon, a damaged statue that sang at dawn when temperature changes made the stone contract and emit an eerie sound. Some carved graffiti on monuments, proving that this behavior is ancient. Lucius Memmius, prefect of the artisans, saw this in the 8th year of Hadrian. The Roman presence transformed Egypt, but Egypt also preserved aspects of its ancient culture, creating a unique Greco-Roman Egyptian fusion visible in mummy portraits, realistic painted faces on wooden panels, executed in classical style but used in traditional Egyptian burial practice. Fact 39. Roman law, one of the empire's most enduring contributions to world civilization, began as customary practice codified in the 12 tables around 450 BCE and evolved over centuries into a sophisticated legal system. The basic division was between ius civil law applying to Roman citizens, and ius gentium, law of nations, which addressed relationships with non-citizens and later developed into broader principles of natural law assumed to apply universally. Roman law recognized property rights in detailed categories, distinguished public and private law, and developed concepts of contract, tort, and inheritance that still underpin modern legal systems. Lawyers called jurisconsulti were legal experts who advised on complex cases, and their opinions gained authority over time. Court cases were public spectacles, especially in the forum where famous advocates like Cicero would argue before large audiences, their speeches blending legal argument with rhetoric designed to sway judges and public opinion. The law wasn't perfectly just. It recognized slavery as legal, treated women as dependents of male guardians, and gave pater familias, the male head of household, enormous power over his family, including theoretically the power of life and death. Yet it also provided structures for dispute resolution, protected property, and allowed people across the empire to engage in commerce with some confidence that agreements would be enforced. Under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE, long after the Western Empire had fallen, a massive compilation called the Corpus Iuris Civilis gathered and organized centuries of Roman legal thinking, preserving it for medieval Europe and beyond. Fact 40. The Romans were prodigious builders of bridges, developing techniques that allowed them to span rivers previously thought impassable and connecting their road network across formidable obstacles. Roman bridges typically rested on stone piers sunk deep into riverbeds, built inside cofferdams, temporary watertight enclosures that allowed workers to excavate and build in dry conditions even in flowing water. The piers supported semicircular arches of stone voussoirs, wedge-shaped blocks that compressed under weight, actually growing stronger as traffic passed over. The bridge at Alcántara in Spain, completed in 106 CE, spans the Tagus River with 6 arches totaling 600 feet, rising over 200 feet above the water at its highest point, and it's still in use today. Many Roman bridges feature cutwaters, pointed projections on the upstream side of piers that divide the current and reduce pressure on the structure. Some bridges carried not just roads but also aqueducts, like the Pont du Gard in southern Gaul, where water flows across the top tier while the lower tiers accommodate foot traffic. Building these structures required massive organization, quarrying stone, transporting it to the site, fabricating timber falsework to support the arches during construction, coordinating hundreds of workers. That so many survive relatively intact testifies to Roman engineering skill and the quality of their materials and techniques. These bridges weren't just functional. They were statements of power, permanent marks on the landscape declaring that Rome could bend nature itself to imperial will. Let the empire's achievements wash over you gently. Bridges spanning rivers, laws bringing order, ships carrying grain across restless seas. There's no test, no need to remember. Just rest in the knowledge that human ingenuity persists across time. Fact 41. The Roman chariot racing circus, particularly the Circus Maximus in Rome, was the empire's most popular spectacle, drawing crowds that dwarfed even the Colosseum's capacity. The Circus Maximus could accommodate perhaps 150,000 spectators, maybe more, on tiered seating that rose on both sides of an oblong track roughly 1,800 feet long and 400 feet wide. Down the center ran the spina, a long barrier decorated with statues, fountains, and lap counters, around which the chariots raced. Each race typically featured 4 teams, the blues, greens, reds, and whites. Though the blues and greens were dominant by the imperial period, their rivalry approaching the fervor of religious devotion. Fans identified passionately with their faction, wearing their team's colors, celebrating victories ecstatically, rioting when they felt cheated. The charioteers, mostly slaves or freedmen, became celebrities, some winning wealth and fame that transcended their lowly origins. The greatest, like Gaius Apuleius Diocles, who raced in the 2nd century CE, won thousands of races and earned fortunes. Racing was fantastically dangerous. Chariots built for speed rather than stability, fragile constructions of wood and leather that shattered in collisions, and charioteers tied the reins around their waists, meaning a crash could drag them to death unless they cut themselves free quickly with the knife each carried. The Circus Maximus was more than entertainment. It was a place where emperor and people came together, where the populace could voice grievances, knowing the emperor was watching and listening, and where social tensions found release in sporting passion. Fact 42. The Roman family, or familia, was a hierarchical unit governed by the paterfamilias, whose authority under traditional law was nearly absolute, extending over his wife, children, slaves, and even adult sons until his death. This patria potestas, father's power, meant he controlled property, arranged marriages, and theoretically could even execute family members, though this right was rarely exercised by imperial times and subject to social disapproval. Yet Roman family life was more nuanced than legal formulas suggest. Marriages among the elite were often arranged for political or economic alliance, but epitaphs on tombstones, written by grieving spouses for each other, suggest real affection developed in many cases. Children were cherished, their early deaths mourned in touching epitaphs. To the spirits of the departed, for Aelius Dionysius, my sweetest son, who lived 1 year and 4 months and 20 days. Romans celebrated coming-of-age ceremonies when boys assumed the toga virilis, the plain white toga of manhood, typically around age 16. Girls married younger, often in their mid-teens, to men who might be significantly older. The ideal Roman wife was supposed to be modest, devoted to her household, skilled in woolworking, the ancient equivalent of managing a complex domestic economy. Yet we know of women who were none of these things, who divorced multiple times, managed businesses, patronized artists, and exercised influence. The gap between ideal and reality was as wide in Rome as in any human society. Fact 43. Roman gardens, whether attached to grand villas or modest urban homes, were designed as spaces of contemplation and pleasure, blending utility with aesthetics in ways that influenced Western garden design for centuries. The grandest gardens, those of imperial villas or wealthy aristocrats, featured precisely clipped hedges forming geometric patterns, long colonnades providing shaded walkways, fish ponds and fountains, sculpture galleries, and pavilions for outdoor dining. Plants chosen for beauty and fragrance included roses, lilies, violets, myrtle, and laurel. Vegetable gardens and orchards supplied the household, with careful attention to espalier techniques and grafting to improve fruit quality. Gardens were shaped by their Greek heritage, with the idea that nature improved by human art was more beautiful than wilderness. Yet Roman gardens also reflected an Italian sensibility, a celebration of abundance and fertility, of the villa as self-sufficient paradise. The elder Pliny, who died in the eruption of Vesuvius, wrote extensively about horticulture in his Natural History, describing grafting techniques, fruit varieties, and agricultural practices. The younger Pliny's letters describe his Tuscan villa's gardens with affection, the carefully planned views, the sound of water trickling in channels, the shaded reading places. These weren't merely ornamental but were seen as moral spaces where the owner could contemplate philosophy, host learned conversations, and refresh spirit as well as body. Excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum have revealed how even modest homes incorporated gardens into their design. Small peristyle courtyards with plantings and perhaps a fountain, bringing nature into domestic space. Fact 44. The Roman army's military medicine was remarkably advanced for its time, with dedicated medical personnel attached to each legion and specialized hospitals called valetudinaria established at permanent camps and fortresses. These military hospitals, excavated at sites throughout the empire, show sophisticated design, individual rooms opening onto corridors rather than large common wards, suggesting concern for isolation of different types of cases, central courtyards providing light and air, separate areas for surgery, storage of medical supplies, and staff quarters. Military doctors, medici, learned their trade through apprenticeship and battlefield experience, developing practical skills in treating wounds, amputations, skull surgery, and extracting arrows and weapon fragments. Surviving surgical instruments show an impressive array of specialized tools. Various scalpels and knives, bone saws, forceps, catheters, surgical hooks, and specula for examining body cavities. The Romans understood the importance of cleanliness in wound treatment, if not the germ theory behind it, and used wine or vinegar as antiseptics. They recognized that some wounds would become infected and turn gangrenous, requiring amputation, though survival rates for this procedure were poor. Soldiers wounded in battle had far better chances of survival in a Roman legion than in most armies before the modern era. This was pragmatic. Legionaries represented massive investment in training and equipment, but the care provided suggests a degree of concern for individual soldiers that contrasts with the image of Rome as coldly efficient war machine. These were men, after all, not machines, and keeping them healthy kept the empire secure. Fact 45. The Roman dining culture extended beyond elaborate dinner parties to include a variety of fast food establishments, bars, and snack counters that served the urban population. In Pompeii, archaeologists have identified over 80 thermopolia, small commercial properties with large earthenware jars called dolia built into masonry counters, where customers could purchase hot food, wine, and drinks. These establishments essentially functioned as ancient fast food restaurants, serving people who lived in small apartments without cooking facilities or who needed a quick meal during their workday. Menus likely included bread, cheese, olives, nuts, dried fruits, lentil stews, and wine. Some thermopolia had small dining areas, but many customers ate standing at the counter or took food away. These weren't fancy establishments. They catered to working people, freedmen, slaves sent by their masters to fetch food. The Roman elite looked down on eating in such places as beneath their dignity, but they were essential to urban life, allowing cities to function without every residence requiring full kitchen facilities. The famous Thermopolium discovered at Pompeii still shows vivid frescoes advertising its offerings, and chemical analysis of residues in the dolia has identified traces of ancient meals: fish, pork, snails, and wine. These establishments were social spaces too, where neighbors would meet, workers would gossip, and the daily life of the city would unfold over humble meals. Fact 46. The Roman funeral and burial practices evolved over the empire's history, but always emphasized the importance of proper rites and maintaining connection between living and dead. In the Republican period, cremation was standard. The body was burned on a funeral pyre, and ashes were collected in urns for burial. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, inhumation in stone sarcophagi became more common, particularly among the wealthy. Both practices could be elaborate affairs for the affluent. A funeral procession might include hired mourners, musicians playing sorrowful melodies, actors wearing wax masks depicting deceased ancestors, creating a spectacle that celebrated the family's lineage as much as the recently dead. The funeral oration, delivered in the forum for prominent citizens, celebrated achievements and virtues, serving political purposes as well as commemorative ones. Burial always occurred outside city walls. Roman law prohibited burial within the pomerium, so major roads leading from cities were lined with tombs and monuments, creating cities of the dead paralleling the cities of the living. The Via Appia near Rome is still flanked by ancient tombs, from grand pyramid-like structures to modest markers. Romans believed the dead existed in a shadowy afterlife but required ongoing attention from the living. Offerings of wine, oil, and food at graves, especially during Parentalia, a February festival when families visited tombs and shared ritual meals with their departed. Tombstone inscriptions often addressed the passerby directly. "Stop, traveler, and read my fate. You will become what I am, and I was what you are." Rest now in the knowledge that even death held meaning for Romans, that memory was preserved in stone, that families remembered their ancestors with offerings and prayers. The dead were not forgotten but woven into the fabric of ongoing life. Fact 47. The province of Britannia, Rome's most northwestern territory, was conquered beginning in 43 CE under Emperor Claudius, though Julius Caesar had mounted brief expeditions a century earlier. The conquest took decades to complete and never extended to all of Britain. Caledonia, modern Scotland, remained unconquered despite repeated campaigns. Roman Britannia developed a distinctive character, a frontier province where Mediterranean culture met the Celtic world. Towns like Londinium, Eboracum, and Verulamium grew behind defensive walls, with forums, bathhouses, and amphitheaters, but never as large or grand as cities in Gaul or Spain. Villas spread across the southeastern countryside, particularly beautiful examples featuring elaborate mosaics with mythological scenes, like the Lulling Stone Villa with its mosaic showing Europa being abducted by Jupiter as a bull. Yet much of Britannia remained deeply Celtic in character, with Roman and native cultures creating hybrid forms. The military presence was substantial. 3 legions stationed here, along with numerous auxiliary cohorts. More troops than in wealthier, more populous provinces, testifying to the challenges of controlling this distant, often rebellious territory. The Antonine Wall, built in the 140 CE even farther north than Hadrian's Wall, was occupied for less than 20 years before being abandoned, the frontier drawing back, Rome accepting the limits of its power. Still, Britannia remained Roman for nearly 4 centuries, producing its own emperors, its own version of Romano-British culture, and when the legions finally withdrew in the early 5th century, they left behind roads, ruins, and memories that would shape Britain's identity for centuries to come. Fact 48. Roman children's lives began with a ceremony called the Dies Lustricus, held 8 days after birth for girls, 9 days for boys, when the child received its name and was formally accepted into the family. Infant mortality was devastatingly high. Perhaps half of children died before age 10, which must have shaped how parents related to young children, though grief at child death seems no less acute in surviving epitaphs. Children who survived infancy played with toys that will seem familiar. Dolls, toy soldiers, balls, hoops to roll with sticks. Wealthier children kept pets, dogs especially, but also birds. Education for those who could afford it began around age 7, with children learning to read and write, studying Homer and Virgil, practicing rhetoric and mathematics. Girls' education often ended in their early teens as they prepared for marriage, while boys from elite families continued studying with philosophers and rhetoricians. But most children from poor families or slave families received no formal education and began working at young ages, learning trades through apprenticeship or laboring in fields and workshops. Archaeological finds give us glimpses of ancient childhood. A child's shoe preserved at Vindolanda, tiny and poignant. Children's graffiti scratched on walls at Pompeii. Cursed tablets where children apparently cursed their tutors. And tombstones decorated with images of children holding their favorite toys or pets, memorials to lives that ended far too soon but were cherished nonetheless. Fact 49. The Roman postal and messenger system, while officially reserved for government use, created the infrastructure that enabled private communication networks to function. Travelers, merchants, and soldiers carried letters for friends and acquaintances, creating an informal system that supplemented the official cursus publicus. The letters that survive, written on papyrus, parchment, or thin wooden tablets, reveal the mundane and moving details of Roman life. At Vindolanda on Hadrian's wall, archaeologists discovered hundreds of inked tablets including birthday party invitations, requests for supplies, and one particularly touching letter from Claudia Severa to Sulpicia Lepidina. I give you a warm invitation to make sure that you come to us, to make the day more enjoyable for me by your arrival. Business letters detail shipments of grain, complain about slow payment, and negotiate prices. Family letters express worry about health, request money, announce births and deaths. People maintained relationships across vast distances. A soldier in Egypt might correspond with family in Italy, a merchant in Gaul with business partners in Syria. The empire's physical infrastructure of roads and ships made this communication possible, but it was human desire for connection that filled those roads with messages, maintaining bonds of family, friendship, and business across thousands of miles and years of separation. Fact 50. Roman religion was fundamentally different from modern monotheistic faiths. It was orthopraxy rather than orthodoxy, concerned with correct practice rather than correct belief. What mattered was performing the proper rituals, making the correct offerings, maintaining the pax deorum, the peace with the gods, rather than having faith or believing particular doctrines. The pantheon was vast and constantly expanding. Traditional Roman gods like Jupiter, Juno, Mars, and Vesta were joined by adopted Greek deities, Eastern gods like Isis and Mithras, and deified emperors. Most Romans saw no contradiction in honoring multiple gods. Religion was about ensuring divine favor and avoiding divine anger, not exclusive devotion. Household religion centered on the Lararium, a shrine to protective household gods, the Laras, guardian spirits, and the Penates, deities of the storeroom. The paterfamilias would lead family in daily prayers and offerings. Public religion involved elaborate festivals throughout the year, sacrifices at temples performed by priests and priestesses, and consultation of omens before important decisions. The state religion's primary purpose was maintaining Rome's prosperity and power. The gods protected Rome, and Romans honored the gods through ritual. This system was both flexible and deeply conservative. New gods could be added, but abandoning traditional practices was dangerous impiety that might anger the gods and bring disaster. This explains Roman suspicion of Christianity, which not only refused to honor traditional gods but insisted on exclusive worship, seeming to threaten the divine protection that had made Rome great. Fact 51. The Roman harbor of Portus, built by Emperor Claudius and greatly expanded by Trajan, supplemented Ostia's facilities and eventually superseded them as Rome's main port. Claudius's harbor, completed around 64 CE, enclosed about 200 acres of water behind two enormous curving moles or breakwaters that extended from the shoreline, with an artificial island in the harbor mouth crowned by a lighthouse modeled on Alexandria's famous Pharos. But this harbor proved vulnerable to storms and silting, So Trajan added an interior hexagonal harbor basin connected to the original by a channel, creating sheltered anchorage for the largest ships. The warehouses around Portus were vast, multi-storied structures capable of storing months of grain supply for Rome. The site included offices, temples, barracks for harbor guards, and workshops for ship repair. Recent archaeological work, including aerial photography and excavation, has revealed the staggering scale of these installations. Rome's lifeline required industrial-scale infrastructure. The harbor connected by canal to the Tiber River, allowing barges to transport goods upstream to Rome itself. When grain ships from Alexandria arrived, their cargoes were offloaded to these barges for the final journey. The entire system, the ships, harbors, canals, warehouses, and distribution networks, represented Rome's solution to a fundamental challenge: how to feed 1 million people in a city without local agricultural surplus. The answer required organization, engineering, and investment that were characteristically Roman: ambitious, practical, and built to last. Fact 52. The Roman fire brigade, the vigiles, served not just as firefighters but as a night watch, patrolling streets, arresting criminals, and maintaining public order after dark. Established by Augustus in 6 CE after a series of devastating fires, including one that destroyed much of Rome's center, the vigiles consisted of 7 cohorts of 1,000 men each, mostly freedmen commanded by equestrian officers. Each cohort was responsible for 2 of Rome's 14 regions, stationed in barracks positions strategically throughout the city. They patrolled with buckets, axes, pumps, ladders, blankets, and sponges soaked in vinegar to protect against smoke. Fighting fires in a city of multi-story wooden apartments separated by narrow streets must have been desperately difficult work. The vigiles could demolish buildings to create fire breaks, and they had legal authority to enter homes and inspect for fire hazards. Despite their efforts, major fires remained a constant threat. The Great Fire of 64 CE during Nero's reign burned for 9 days, destroying 10 of Rome's 14 districts. Nero's response included rebuilding with wider streets, height restrictions on buildings, and requirements for more stone construction, showing how disaster drove improvements in urban planning. The vigiles remained one of Rome's essential services, less glamorous than the legions or Praetorian Guard but vital to the city's survival, working through smoke-filled nights to save what they could while the city slept or, too often, fled from flames that turned neighborhoods into infernos. Let the flames flicker in your imagination and then fade. Let the empire's daily struggles, the fires fought, the letters written, the children playing in dusty streets, remind you that history was lived by people who faced ordinary problems with courage and care. Fact 53. The Roman Stadium, distinct from both circus and amphitheater, was designed specifically for Greek-style athletic competitions. Foot races, wrestling, boxing, and pentathlon events. The Stadium of Domitian in Rome, completed around 86 CE on the site now occupied by Piazza Navona, could hold about 20,000 spectators who watched athletic contests modeled on Greek tradition but never as popular in Rome as chariot racing or gladiatorial combat. Romans considered Greek athletics somewhat effeminate, the emphasis on naked competition particularly scandalous, though Greek-style games gained imperial patronage and a degree of acceptance. The stadium's elongated U-shape, about 275 meters long, accommodated foot races of various distances. The structure followed typical Roman design with load-bearing walls supporting tiers of seating, arched entrances, and probably a colonnade providing shade. After the empire's fall, the stadium gradually became built over, houses and churches filling the interior, but the outline remained, preserved in the distinctive oval shape of modern Piazza Navona, one of Rome's most beautiful public spaces. Walking through the piazza today, you're walking on what was once the stadium floor, the Baroque fountains now occupying space where athletes once competed, though if you descend below street level in certain locations, you can still see ancient arches and walls, ghosts of the stadium buried beneath centuries of accumulated life. Fact 54. The Roman occupation of the Levant brought them into direct contact and ultimately conflict with the Jewish people, whose monotheism and prohibition against images of God created unique challenges for Roman administration. After suppressing a major revolt from 66 to 70 CE, Roman forces under Titus besieged Jerusalem, eventually breaching its walls and destroying the Second Temple in 70 CE, an event commemorated by the Arch of Titus in Rome, which still stands showing reliefs of Roman soldiers carrying the temple's menorah and other sacred objects as spoils. The destruction of the temple fundamentally transformed Judaism, shifting religious practice from temple sacrifice to synagogue worship and rabbinic scholarship. A second major revolt from 132 to 135 CE, led by Simon Bar Kokhba, prompted Emperor Hadrian to take punitive measures including renaming Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina and banning Jews from the city, and renaming the entire province from Judea to Syria Palestina. The Jewish diaspora, already significant before these revolts, became more pronounced as communities spread throughout the empire and beyond, maintaining their religious identity while adapting to life under various rulers. Roman sources like Tacitus and Josephus, himself a Romanized Jew, provide perspectives on these conflicts, though always filtered through their own biases and purposes. The tensions between Roman universalism, which required at minimum nominal acknowledgement of traditional gods and imperial cult, and Jewish insistence on exclusive worship of one god, foreshadowed the later conflicts between Rome and Christianity. Fact 55. The Roman villa rustica, the working farm estate, was the backbone of agricultural production in Italy and the provinces, especially producing the wine and olive oil that were staples of Mediterranean diet and commerce. These estates varied enormously in size, from modest properties to enormous latifundia covering thousands of acres, typically worked by slave labor supplemented by seasonal free workers. The villa owner, if wealthy, might visit occasionally from his townhouse, leaving day-to-day management to a villicus, an estate steward, often himself a slave or freedman. The agricultural year followed predictable rhythms: plowing and planting in autumn, pruning in winter, harvest in summer, olive pressing in late autumn. Olive cultivation was particularly important. Olive trees, once established, produced for generations with minimal care, their oil used for cooking, lighting, cosmetics, and ritual purposes. Wine production required more labor. Vines needed careful tending. Grapes had to be harvested at the right moment, then crushed and fermented in large clay vessels called dolia. The Romans weren't the first Mediterranean vintners, but they systematized viticulture, developing numerous varieties suited to different soils and climates, aging techniques, and an appreciation for vintage and terroir that prefigures modern wine culture. Agricultural writers like Cato the Elder, Varro, and Columella wrote detailed treatises on farm management, vine training, olive cultivation, and animal husbandry, texts that preserved ancient techniques and influenced European agriculture for centuries. The Roman agricultural system, dependent on slavery and focused on cash crops for urban markets rather than subsistence, created wealth for landowners but also vulnerability. When the empire's economic system eventually collapsed, these estates fragmented, and agricultural production declined sharply. Fact 56. The Roman appetite for exotic animals and the infrastructure to supply them created a vast trade network that reached far beyond the empire's boundaries. For the Venetians, the wild animal hunt staged in amphitheaters, Romans imported lions and leopards from Africa, bears from the forests of Germania and Britannia, elephants from North Africa, even crocodiles from Egypt. Professional hunters, called venators, tracked and captured these animals, a dangerous occupation requiring knowledge of animal behavior and specialized capture techniques. The animals were then transported in cages on ships and wagons to Rome and other cities, a logistical challenge that resulted in many deaths en route. At the games, these animals would fight each other or armed human hunters in choreographed spectacles that demonstrated Roman dominion over nature itself. Emperors competed to present the most exotic and numerous animals. Trajan's games celebrating his Dacian victory allegedly featured 11,000 animals killed over 123 days. The ecological impact was significant. North African elephants and lions were hunted to near extinction in their ranges. The sheer scale of this trade, and Romans' willingness to invest in it, shows how important spectacle was to Roman political culture. Keeping the populace entertained, giving them experiences they could never have otherwise. Seeing a rhinoceros or watching trained elephants perform tricks was considered essential to maintaining social stability and imperial prestige. Fact 57. Roman military camps followed standardized layouts regardless of location, creating instant fortified towns wherever the legions stopped. When a legion halted for the night, even on campaign, they built a fortified camp from scratch, digging ditches, raising earthwork ramparts, sharpening wooden stakes for palisades, laying out streets in a grid pattern, and erecting leather tents. The camp was rectangular with 4 gates aligned to cardinal directions. The Via Praetoria ran from the main gate to the headquarters. The Via Principalis crossed it at right angles, creating a central intersection where the Praetorium, the commander's tent, stood with the forum and shrine to the standards nearby. Each unit had its designated location, the same spot in every camp, so every soldier knew where he belonged. This standardization had practical benefits. Reinforcements arriving at an unfamiliar camp could immediately orient themselves and find their positions. Permanent camps, where legions were stationed for years or decades, evolved into substantial fortified towns with stone walls, barracks, headquarters buildings, hospitals, bathhouses, workshops, granaries, and temples. These camps became cities in their own right. Eboracum, modern York, began as a legionary fortress, as did Castra Regina, modern Regensburg, and many others. Even today, you can recognize former Roman military sites by their street plans, the grid pattern with main streets meeting at right angles, a layout the Romans stamped across 3 continents, transforming landscape through organization and repetition. Breathe slowly now, letting the empire's vast organizational genius wash over you like a gentle tide. The camps, the farms, the animal hunts, all pieces of an enormous machine that was also made of human hopes and fears, ambitions and exhaustion. Fact 58. The Emperor Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305 CE, fundamentally restructured the empire in response to the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of civil war, foreign invasion, and near collapse. Diocletian's reforms included dividing the empire into administrative districts, multiplying the provinces and creating a hierarchy of officials, establishing the Tetrarchy, ruled by 4 emperors, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, to provide more effective governance and succession planning, and implementing extensive price and wage controls to combat inflation. He moved away from the traditional Principate's fiction that the emperor was merely first citizen, instead embracing openly autocratic rule with elaborate court ceremony borrowed from Persian models. He also launched the last and most severe persecution of Christians, ordering the destruction of churches and Christian scriptures, and requiring traditional sacrifices on pain of death, though this persecution ultimately failed and was abandoned by his successors. Diocletian's administrative reforms proved more lasting than his tetrarchy, which collapsed into civil war after his voluntary retirement in 305, a retirement unprecedented for a Roman emperor, showing perhaps how exhausted he was by the burdens of rule. He withdrew to his vast palace at Split in modern Croatia, a fortified complex that was part military camp, part luxury residence, where he famously told colleagues who urged his return to power that he was much happier growing cabbages. The palace still stands, now surrounded by the modern city that grew within and around its walls, a remarkable survival that captures the transition from classical antiquity to medieval Europe. Fact 59. Roman mining operations, particularly for silver and gold, required extensive labor forces and sophisticated techniques for extracting ore and refining metal. Spain's silver mines provided enormous wealth, particularly the Rio Tinto mines where Romans extracted copper, silver, and gold using hydraulic mining techniques, channeling water to blast away hillsides and expose ore-bearing rock. The workings extended deep underground in galleries supported by timber, ventilated by shafts, and drained by systems of channels and water wheels. Miners worked by lamplight, chipping ore from the rock face with picks and iron wedges, hauling it to the surface in baskets. The work was grueling and dangerous. Collapses, flooding, and bad air killed regularly. Much of the workforce consisted of slaves, particularly those condemned to the mines as punishment, laboring in conditions that amounted to a death sentence. Yet free workers and contractors operated mines as well, and some miners earned enough to purchase slaves of their own. The metal extracted, gold for coinage and decoration, silver for denarii, copper for bronze vessels and architectural fixtures, flowed throughout the empire, enabling commerce and enriching the treasury. Roman mining engineering influenced techniques for centuries. Their methods of surveying, tunneling, and/or processing wouldn't be significantly improved until the Industrial Revolution. The landscape still bears scars from Roman mining. At Las Medulas in Spain, hydraulic mining removed entire hillsides, creating a surreal terrain of eroded red and gold pinnacles, beautiful now but testimony to environmental impacts that Romans pursued without concern for conservation. Fact 60. The Roman gladius, the short sword carried by legionaries, became iconic of Roman military might, though it was likely adapted from Spanish sword designs encountered during Roman expansion in Iberia. The gladius was typically about 18 to 24 inches long with a broad, double-edged blade tapering to a sharp point, designed for thrusting rather than slashing. In close formation combat, where Roman legions excelled, this thrusting action was devastatingly effective. A soldier could stab forward from behind his shield without exposing himself, driving the point into an enemy's abdomen or chest. The Romans mass-produced these weapons with remarkable consistency, suggesting standardized manufacturing processes and quality control. Archaeological finds show gladii across the empire, from Britannia to Syria, proof of how thoroughly Roman military equipment was distributed. Alongside the gladius, legionaries carried the pilum, a specialized throwing javelin with a long iron shank designed to bend on impact, rendering an enemy's shield useless and preventing the weapon from being thrown back. This combination of equipment, along with armor and large rectangular shields, made legionaries formidable in pitched battle, while strict training and iron discipline made them nearly unstoppable. The gladius remained standard issue for centuries until changes in military tactics and increased importance of cavalry eventually led to its replacement with longer swords. But its legacy persists. The very word gladiator comes from gladius, and when we imagine Roman soldiers, we imagine them carrying this short, brutal, efficient blade. Fact 61. Roman decorative arts, particularly mosaic, reached extraordinary sophistication, transforming utilitarian flooring into artistic masterpieces. Mosaics were composed of tesserae, small cubes of stone, glass, or ceramic, set in mortar to create images and patterns. The simplest mosaics used black and white tesserae in geometric designs, while the most complex, called opus vermiculatum, used tiny tesserae in many colors to create detailed pictures with subtle shading and perspective. The Alexander mosaic from Pompey's House of the Faun, showing Alexander the Great in battle against Darius III of Persia, contains approximately 1.5 million tesserae and demonstrates technical virtuosity that rivals painting. Master craftsmen called musaverii led workshops of assistants, working from drawings called cartoons, setting tesserae carefully to create forms that would be walked on, furniture dragged across, and water splashed on for decades or centuries. Popular subjects included geometric patterns, decorative borders of vegetation and scrollwork, depictions of mythology and daily life, and in later periods, Christian religious imagery. Some mosaics show remarkable humor, a guard dog accompanied by the warning, "Cave Canem," beware of the dog. Dining room floors showing unswept food scraps in trompe-l'oeil, toilet floors decorated with mouse and frog scenes perhaps meant to be amusing during use. These artworks have survived remarkably well, colors still vibrant under excavated ruins, offering us direct visual connection to Roman aesthetic sensibilities. Walking on a Roman mosaic in a museum, protected now behind ropes and glass, you see exactly what a Roman homeowner saw, the colors and forms unchanged by time in ways that paint and textile cannot match. Fact 62. The Roman transportation of massive architectural elements, columns, capitals, statuary, required engineering ingenuity equal to their construction techniques. Granite columns for temples might be quarried in Egypt, shipped hundreds of miles down the Nile, transferred to seagoing vessels, and transported across the Mediterranean to Rome, each weighing dozens of tons. The obelisks brought from Egypt as trophies and decorative elements required especially complex operations. The obelisk now standing in Vatican's St. Peter's Square, originally erected in Alexandria, weighs about 300 tons. Its transport to Rome in the 1st century CE required a specially built ship, and its re-erection during the Renaissance became a major engineering challenge. Romans moved such massive objects using wooden rollers, sleds, complex pulley systems, and sheer muscle power. Hundreds of workers and draft animals coordinated in elaborate choreography. They built special roads reinforced to handle the weight. Construction sites had treadwheel cranes, large wooden frameworks with wheels turned by men walking inside them like hamsters, generating the force to lift heavy materials. The organization required coordinating quarrying, transport, assembly, thousands of workers, was as impressive as the technical skill. These monuments were propaganda-made stone, demonstrating Rome's ability to mobilize resources from across the empire and bend those resources to imperial will. That we can still see these obelisks, columns from African quarries standing in Rome's forums, is testimony not just to their physical durability but to the logistical triumph of moving them in the first place. Fact 63. Roman watermills harnessed water power for grinding grain, a significant technological advance that increased efficiency and reduced labor. The most impressive example, at Barbigal in southern Gaul, was a complex of 16 water wheels arranged in 2 parallel sets fed by aqueduct water, capable of producing perhaps 10 tons of flour daily, enough to supply a substantial urban population. Each wheel turned a millstone, the water cascading from one level to the next down a hillside. This industrial-scale installation suggests surprising sophistication in mechanical engineering and represents early application of water power beyond simple individual mills. Most milling occurred at smaller scale, single water mills on streams, or traditional rotary hand mills called querns where women ground grain in households. But the Romans recognized water power's potential and exploited it where hydraulic and economic conditions made it feasible. The Barbigal complex likely supplied military forces or urban bakers in our late, modern halls, freeing human and animal labor for other purposes. After the empire's fall, much of this technology was lost or simplified. Many medieval communities reverted to hand milling or simpler single-wheel installations. The Roman period represented, in some respects, a peak of ancient technology that wouldn't be matched again for centuries, though historians debate how widely these advanced techniques were actually implemented versus remaining localized examples of what Roman engineering could achieve at its best. Let your mind drift across the empire's landscapes now. Water-turning wheels, workers hauling stones, craftsmen setting tiny tesserae into floors that would last 2,000 years. There's nothing to grasp, nothing to hold. Just let these images move through like clouds across a summer sky. Fact 64. The Roman toga, that distinctive draped garment, was the formal dress of Roman citizens, particularly for public occasions, legal proceedings, and religious rituals. Constructed from a large semicircular piece of white woolen cloth, the toga was draped around the body in complex folds that required practice to arrange properly and assistance to put on. The toga's weight and restriction made it impractical for labor or military service, marking it clearly as the costume of citizenship and leisure. Different border decorations indicated status. Senators wore togas with a broad purple stripe, the toga praetexta, while boys and magistrates wore similar garments. A plain white toga, the toga virilis, marked adult male citizenship. The toga candida, whitened with chalk, was worn by candidates for office, giving us the word candidate. Former generals might wear the purple and gold toga picta for triumphal processions. By the late Empire, the toga had become so cumbersome and associated with formal occasions that many Romans avoided wearing it, preferring more practical tunics, but it retained symbolic importance as the defining garment of Roman identity. Foreigners and slaves could not legally wear it, making the toga both costume and badge of belonging. The phrase toga wearing became shorthand for Roman as opposed to barbarian, civilized versus uncivilized. When Romans depicted themselves in art and statuary, they often chose the toga despite its increasing rarity in actual daily wear, because it represented an ideal, a connection to ancestral virtue and citizenship that remained potent even as the reality faded. Fact 65. The construction of Rome's Colosseum required immense resources and sophisticated logistics, beginning with the draining and filling of the artificial lake that had been part of Nero's Golden House complex. Workers built a massive elliptical foundation, then raised walls of travertine limestone blocks, each weighing several tons, held together with iron clamps rather than mortar. An estimated 300 tons of iron went into these connections, much of it stripped out in later centuries for reuse, leaving the characteristic holes still visible in the structure. The Colosseum's outer wall stood roughly 160 feet high and was pierced by 80 arched entrances at ground level, allowing rapid entry and exit for the massive crowds. Inside, the seating rose in tiers, strictly segregated by social class. The underground hypogeum, added after the building's completion, contained cages, machinery, elevators operated by pulley systems and counterweights, and prop storage. The arena floor above, originally wooden, could be removed to flood the arena for naval battles, though this seems to have been discontinued after the hypogeum was added. The Colosseum's engineering included sophisticated crowd management. Numbered entrances matched to numbered seats, multiple staircases and corridors called vomitoria that could empty the building of 50,000 spectators in minutes. Even in its ruined state, weathered by earthquakes, stone robbers, and pollution, the Colosseum remains Rome's most recognizable monument, symbol of both the empire's grandeur and its brutal entertainments, a complex legacy captured in stone that still draws millions of visitors who circle its arcades trying to imagine the roar of ancient crowds. Fact 66. Roman silver mines in Spain and Britain produced the metal for denarii, the standard silver coin that served as the empire's primary currency for centuries. A denarius represented a day's wages for a common laborer, making it a practical denomination for everyday transactions. The coin showed the emperor's portrait on one side, a powerful tool for spreading imperial image throughout the empire, and various symbolic images on the reverse. Deities, military victories, buildings, political messages. Over time, the silver content of denarii was gradually debased, reduced from nearly pure silver under Augustus to barely 50% under the Severan dynasty in the early 3rd century, as emperors struggled to finance government expenses and pay armies. This inflation contributed to economic instability, with prices rising as the money's intrinsic value fell. The currency system included gold aurei, worth 25 denarii and used for large transactions and paying soldiers bonuses, and bronze or brass sestertii and asses for small purchases. Despite periodic debasement and inflation, Roman coinage remained remarkably stable and widely accepted for centuries, facilitating trade across the Mediterranean and beyond. Hoards of Roman coins have been found as far as India and Scandinavia, proof of their acceptance and value even in regions beyond imperial control. The empire's monetary economy, sophisticated for its time, allowed specialization and long-distance trade that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the late medieval period. Fact 67. The Roman garrison town, or castellum, wherever the army established permanent presence, became the nucleus for civilian settlement. Merchants, artisans, innkeepers, bath owners, prostitutes, and eventually families of soldiers who technically couldn't legally marry during service but formed stable unions regardless. These settlements, called canabi or vici, grew up outside fortress walls, gradually developing their own infrastructure of shops, temples, houses, and eventually defensive walls. Many modern European cities trace their origins to Roman military camps. Cologne from Colonia Agrippinensis, Vienna from Vindobona, Chester from Deva Victrix. The military presence created demand for goods and services, injecting currency into local economies through soldiers' pay. Soldiers also interacted with native populations, forming cultural bridges even as they represented occupation. Auxiliary troops recruited from provincial populations served alongside Italian legionaries, learning Latin, adopting Roman customs, and earning citizenship upon discharge. These veterans often settled near their posts, receiving land grants and establishing families, becoming agents of Romanization. The military frontier was thus always more permeable than it might appear, a zone of exchange as much as barrier, where Roman and native cultures influenced each other, where the empire's formal boundaries mattered less than the daily reality of people trying to live their lives, trade, intermarry, and navigate between different cultural worlds. Fact 68. Roman concrete construction allowed the building of unprecedented architectural forms, particularly the great bath complexes where concrete vaults spanned enormous interior spaces without internal supports. The caldarium, or hot room, in the baths of Caracalla covered more than 30,000 square feet under crossed vaults that soared over 100 feet high, creating steam-filled spaces lit by high windows where hundreds could bathe simultaneously. These enormous structures required not just material engineering but environmental engineering. The hypo-cost heating systems that warmed floors and walls, the complex plumbing that supplied hot and cold water, the massive furnaces that burned constantly, tended by slaves who worked in sweltering heat. The largest bath complexes employed hundreds of staff, furnace workers, masseurs, attendants, cleaners, guards. For Roman citizens, the baths were daily destinations, social clubs where one might spend hours exercising in the palestra, bathing through progressively hotter rooms, getting a massage, reading in the library, or simply conversing with friends and acquaintances. Entrance fees were minimal or free, making baths accessible across social classes, though facilities were segregated by gender and time. Women might bathe in morning hours, men in afternoon and evening, or separate facilities served each gender. The bath complex represented Roman civilization at its most characteristic, combining advanced engineering, public health, social cohesion, and sensual pleasure in monumental architecture that declared the empire's power to transform daily life. Fact 69. Roman ship construction, particularly merchant vessels, employed sophisticated techniques including the mortise and tenon joinery for hull planking, where wooden pegs locked planks together creating strong, watertight hulls. Ships ranged from small coastal traders to massive grain ships of 600 tons or more, capable of carrying enough wheat to feed several thousand people for a year. These grain ships, particularly those on the Alexandria to Rome route, were the supertankers of the ancient world, with multiple decks, capacious holds, and crews of dozens of sailors, navigators, and support staff. Roman mariners navigated using landmarks, celestial observation, and accumulated knowledge of currents and winds, though voyages remained seasonal. Sailing was considered too dangerous during winter months when storms made Mediterranean travel treacherous. Ships also carried passengers, wealthy travelers bringing their own slaves and provisions, humbler passengers buying passage in cargo holds, merchants accompanying their goods. Shipwrecks, tragically common, have become treasure troves for archaeologists, their cargoes preserved on the seafloor, amphorae full of wine, olive oil, or fish sauce, statues and architectural elements, personal possessions of passengers and crew. These underwater sites tell stories of commerce, culture, and sometimes catastrophe, Roman ships that set out confidently and never reached port, their voyages ending in storms or on rocks, their cargoes resting beneath Mediterranean waves for 2 millennia until modern technology allows their recovery and study. Let the Mediterranean waters hold you gently now, rocking like those ancient ships, carrying their precious cargoes across a liquid highway that connected 3 continents. Rest in the knowledge that the empire was built on these journeys, on the courage of sailors and the strength of wooden hulls against the sea. Fact 70. The Roman Emperor Constantine, who ruled from 306 to 337 CE, fundamentally altered the empire's trajectory by embracing Christianity and founding Constantinople as a new capital. His conversion, traditionally dated to 312 CE before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where he supposedly saw a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer," transformed Christianity from persecuted sect to favored religion almost overnight. Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313, granting religious tolerance, returned confiscated Christian property, funded church construction, and involved himself in theological disputes, convening the Council of Nicaea in 325 to address the Arian controversy. His new capital, Constantinople, built on the site of the ancient Greek city Byzantium, was consciously designed as a Christian Rome, though it retained classical architectural forms and administrative structures. The city's strategic location, controlling access between Europe and Asia, between Mediterranean and Black Sea, made it economically and militarily valuable. Constantinople would survive as capital of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years after Rome itself fell, preserving Roman law, Greek culture, and Christian theology in unique synthesis. Constantine himself was baptized only on his deathbed, following contemporary custom that baptism washed away all sins and was therefore best delayed. His legacy is enormously complex. To Christians, he's the first Christian emperor, protector of the faith. To traditionalists, the emperor who abandoned Rome's ancient gods and split the empire's center of gravity. To historians, a pragmatic politician who recognized Christianity's growing power and harnessed it to imperial purposes while genuinely believing he served divine will. Fact 71. Roman urban housing varied dramatically by social class. The wealthy lived in domus, spacious townhouses built around interior courtyards, with multiple rooms, private bathrooms, gardens, and decorative frescoes and mosaics, while the majority of urban residents lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that could rise 5 or 6 floors, with ground floor shops and progressively smaller, cheaper apartments higher up. The insulae of Rome housed tens of thousands in cramped conditions. Small rooms, minimal furnishings, no running water or sanitation in most units, constant fire risk from cooking braziers and oil lamps. The ground floor or sometimes first floor apartments were most desirable, while residents of upper floors faced climbing stairs and living in spaces that were hot in summer, cold in winter, and structurally questionable. Building collapses were common enough to be regulated by law and commented on by satirists like Juvenal, who complained about the hazards of urban life. Yet these buildings, for all their dangers and discomforts, allowed Rome to house 1 million people in a relatively compact area, creating urban density unmatched in European history until the 19th century. Ostia's surviving insulae, better preserved than Rome's, show buildings of surprising sophistication, brick-faced concrete construction, large windows, balconies, and often decorative facades. Urban life for the majority meant small private spaces but extensive public areas. Forums, baths, theaters, temples, where much of life unfolded. The insulae's cramped conditions drove residents into public space, making Roman cities intensely social, crowded, noisy, vibrant places where private and public life existed in constant tension and interaction. Fact 72. The Roman appreciation of luxury goods created trade networks extending far beyond imperial boundaries, with silk arriving via the Silk Road from China, spices and gems from India, amber from the Baltic, incense from Arabia, and ivory from sub-Saharan Africa. These exotic imports were sold in specialized markets or by individual merchants, commanding prices that made fortunes for successful traders. Silk especially captivated Roman elites. The gossamer fabric, unknown in the West until trade routes opened, was literally worth its weight in gold. Roman moralists complained that wealthy women wearing transparent silk gowns might as well be naked, and that Roman gold was draining eastward in exchange for frivolous luxury, but demand remained insatiable. The mechanisms of long-distance trade were complex. Goods changed hands multiple times, passing through kingdoms and tribal territories, each middleman taking profit, so that final prices in Rome bore little relation to production costs in distant lands. Few Roman merchants traveled the complete routes. Instead, specialized traders operated different segments. Indian merchants might trade with Arabs at Red Sea ports, Arabs with Syrians at Palmyra, Syrians with Greeks at Antioch, and so forth, goods traveling hand-to-hand across continents. This trade enriched not just Roman merchants but intermediary kingdoms and city-states that grew wealthy taxing or facilitating commerce. When instability disrupted trade routes, luxury prices soared and Roman elites grumbled, not understanding the geopolitical complexities that governed whether silk and spices would flow west or not. Fact 73. Roman medicine included surgical procedures of surprising sophistication, as evidenced by the instruments discovered in excavations. Scalpels with interchangeable blades, forceps for various purposes, bone drills for trepanation, catheters, vaginal specula with screw mechanisms for dilation, and specialized tools for removing arrowheads. Military surgeons especially gained expertise treating wounds, performing amputations when necessary, though survival rates for major surgery remained poor without antibiotics or understanding of infection. Cataract surgery was performed by couching, displacing the clouded lens to restore some vision. Caesarean sections were attempted, though rarely with maternal survival. Roman medical writers like Celsus documented procedures in remarkable detail, describing ligature of blood vessels during surgery, treatment of skull fractures, removal of bladder stones, and reduction of dislocations. Pain management relied on alcohol, opium, and sometimes mandrake, though none could provide the complete anesthesia we take for granted. Patients facing major surgery must have required immense courage, knowing the agony they'd endure and the strong likelihood they wouldn't survive. Yet Roman physicians tried, developing their craft through observation and accumulated experience, and the best earned reputations that transcended their era. The physician's tools, utilitarian objects of bronze and iron, beautifully made and frighteningly sharp, remain testament to ancient medicine's ambitions and limitations, to the desire to heal that persists across all cultures and times even when techniques remain crude and success uncertain. Fact 74. The Roman approach to urban planning involved not just practical considerations like water supply and waste removal, but also aesthetic and symbolic elements. Wide colonnaded streets, prominent temples, theaters and amphitheaters as architectural focal points, and public squares surrounded by administrative buildings. New cities founded as colonies followed standardized plans derived from military camps, with streets in regular grids, forums at the center, and walls encompassing the settlement. Timgad in North Africa, founded by Trajan in 100 CE as a veterans' colony, preserves this ideal plan remarkably well. Square walls, two main streets intersecting at right angles at the forum, secondary streets creating rectangular blocks, the whole design stamped onto the landscape as an assertion of Roman order over African territory. Established cities that came under Roman rule adapted more gradually, adding Roman elements, baths, temples, amphitheaters, to existing urban fabric, creating hybrid cityscapes where indigenous and Roman forms coexisted. The result across the empire was both standardization and diversity. Everywhere certain elements appeared, forums, bathhouses, temples to Jupiter and the imperial cult, yet each city retained local character, local gods alongside Roman ones. Local architectural traditions merged with Roman techniques. This flexible approach to urbanization allowed Roman culture to spread without completely obliterating local identities, creating a cosmopolitan civilization that could accommodate tremendous diversity within an overarching unity of language, law, and shared political identity. Rest now in this image of cities scattered across the empire like seeds, each growing according to Roman pattern yet each unique, shaped by local landscape and culture. Let the empire's vast diversity cradle you as you drift toward sleep or continue listening, as you choose. The stories are here regardless, patient and eternal. Fact 75. The Roman cursus honorum, the sequence of public offices that ambitious men climbed, structured political careers according to age requirements and established progression. A man typically began with military service, then at 30 could seek election as quaestor, handling financial administration. At 37, he might become aedile, responsible for public buildings, games, and markets, though this position was optional. The praetorship came at 40, involving judicial duties and provincial governorships. Finally, at 43, one could seek the consulship, the pinnacle of public honor. Former consuls might govern important provinces, lead armies, or simply enjoy their prestige. This structured career path, theoretically based on merit and election, in reality depended heavily on family connections, wealth, and political alliances. A young man from an established senatorial family had immense advantages over a new man, a novice homo, entering politics without ancestral office holders. Still, the system provided a framework that valued experience and age, preventing very young men from wielding too much power too soon. The competition was fierce. Many men held lower offices but never reached the consulship, ending their careers as praetors or legates, respected but not achieving ultimate political glory. Under the emperors, the cursus honorum continued, but its meaning changed. Offices became stepping stones in imperial service rather than independent powers, and the emperor's favor mattered more than popular election. Yet the structure persisted, providing careers for the elite and maintaining the fiction of republican government even as autocracy became reality. Fact 76. Roman religious festivals filled the calendar, marking the agricultural year, honoring gods, and commemorating historical events. The Saturnalia in December was especially beloved. Several days when social norms inverted, masters served their slaves at banquets, gambling was permitted, and gifts were exchanged. The festival honored Saturn, ancient god of agriculture, and celebrated the winter solstice and promise of returning light. Lupercalia in February involved priests running nearly naked through Rome, striking women with goatskin strips, supposedly promoting fertility. The Vestalia in June honored Vesta and her sacred flame, when her temple opened and married women could enter barefoot to offer food. Each festival had specific rituals, often ancient and obscure in origin even to Romans, performed because tradition demanded it and neglecting them might anger the gods. Religious festivals provided relief from work, opportunities for community celebration, and reinforced social bonds and cultural identity. As Christianity rose, many pagan festivals were either suppressed or absorbed into Christian calendar. Saturnalia's gift-giving migrated to Christmas. Spring fertility festivals became Easter celebrations. This syncretism eased the transition from pagan to Christian culture, allowing familiar celebrations to continue with new theological meanings. Though some traditional practices persisted for centuries after official conversion, too deeply rooted in popular culture to be easily eliminated. Fact 77. The Rhine and Danube rivers formed the empire's northern frontier for much of its history, natural barriers behind which Rome built defensive systems and beyond which lay the territories of Germanic and other peoples Rome never permanently conquered. The limes, the frontier defensive zone, consisted of fortresses, watchtowers, walls in some sections, patrol roads, and supporting infrastructure. Roman garrisons stared across rivers at free Germanic tribes, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, always wary. The frontier wasn't sealed but permeable. Traders crossed, Germanic warriors served in Roman auxiliary units, refugees and migrants sought admission to imperial territory. This frontier zone developed its own distinctive culture, neither purely Roman nor purely Germanic, but hybrid, practical, militarized. The frontier stability depended on Roman military strength and political organization, but also on relationships with Germanic leaders, subsidies paid to keep peace, diplomatic marriages, and hostage exchanges. When these relationships broke down, when internal Roman problems distracted attention and resources from frontier defense, Germanic peoples crossed in raids or larger movements, sometimes seeking land, sometimes fleeing pressures from other peoples pushing westward from the steppes. The great migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries, what older scholarship called barbarian invasions, involved complex interactions of push and pull, Rome's declining military capacity, and Germanic peoples' own pressures and ambitions. The Rhine-Danube frontier, held for centuries, ultimately couldn't contain these forces, and the Western Empire fragmented into Romano-Germanic kingdoms that were both Rome's heirs and its terminators. Fact 78. Roman glassmaking reached remarkable sophistication, producing everything from utilitarian bottles and windows to luxury items like the Portland vase, a cameo glass masterpiece with white figures carved against a dark blue background, created around the time of Augustus and still viewable in the British Museum. The Romans didn't invent glass but perfected its production and expanded its uses dramatically. Glass blowing, developed in the 1st century BCE in Syria or Palestine, revolutionized the industry, allowing quick production of vessels in endless shapes at reasonable prices. Glass windows, while expensive, appeared in wealthy homes and bathhouses, admitting light while blocking wind. Glassmakers created colored glass by adding metallic oxides, cobalt for blue, copper for green, manganese for purple. They learned to make translucent and transparent glass, essential for windows and fine tableware. Specialized forms included unguentaria, small bottles for perfumes and oils, and lacrimaria, tear bottles supposedly for collecting mourners' tears, though this use is disputed. The Roman glass industry centered in several regions, Egypt and Syria especially, producing goods traded throughout the empire. Recycling was common. Broken glass, called cullet, could be melted down and reused, making glass a relatively sustainable material. Ancient glassware that survived burial or submersion often developed iridescent surface patinas, creating rainbow sheens we find beautiful, though this weathering wasn't intentional. The translucent colors and elegant forms of Roman glass still influence modern designers, testimony to aesthetic achievements 2 millennia old. Fact 79. Roman slavery, while central to the economy, existed alongside a significant free working class. Farmers owning small plots, artisans operating workshops, shopkeepers, laborers, freedmen working as clients of former masters or independently. The free poor lived precariously, dependent on patron relationships, occasional public distributions of grain, and whatever work they could find. Rome's grain dole, the annona, provided monthly rations to perhaps 200,000 registered recipients, preventing starvation but not guaranteeing prosperity. The dole was a political necessity. Keeping the urban masses fed was essential to preventing riots and maintaining order. Bread and circuses, Juvenal's famous phrase, captured the government's strategy of providing food and entertainment to keep the populace pacified. Yet this view is too cynical. The grain dole also represented an acknowledgement of responsibility, a recognition that the state should ensure citizens' survival. Distribution occurred monthly at designated locations, each recipient presenting a token, the tessera frumentaria, proving their registration. The system required significant administration, tracking recipients, shipping grain from Africa and Egypt, storing it in massive granaries, distributing it regularly. When grain shipments were delayed by weather or piracy, Rome faced potential crisis. The annona represented both Roman organizational capacity and the vulnerability of a million-person city dependent on food imported from across the Mediterranean. a fragile system that somehow persisted for centuries until the Western Empire's collapse disrupted the supply networks that sustained the capital. Fact 80. The Roman villa in its mature form combined agricultural production with cultured leisure, allowing wealthy owners to enjoy rustic retreats while profiting from their estates. Pliny the Younger's letters describing his villas in Tuscany and at Laurentum show how elite Romans thought about these properties. He details architectural features, describes views and gardens, mentions productive vineyards and olive groves almost casually, and emphasizes how the villa allows him to read, write, and think without Rome's distractions. The villa represented an ideal of odium cum dignitate, leisure with dignity, rural retirement not as escape from responsibility but as space for intellectual pursuits and supervision of agricultural wealth. Not all villas matched this ideal. Some were primarily agricultural operations where the owner rarely visited, others were luxurious retreats without serious farming. The most elaborate villas, like Hadrian's at Tivoli, were essentially small cities, sprawling complexes of buildings, gardens, waterworks, theaters, libraries, and temples spread across hundreds of acres, expressing the emperor's vision of ideal environment. These villas consciously evoked Greek architecture and landscaping, particularly Greek philosophical school settings, connecting Roman leisure to Hellenic intellectual traditions. The villa became a literary topos, a standard subject in poetry and letters, representing retreat from urban corruption, return to ancestral simplicity, communion with nature. Even though real villas were sophisticated, expensive, and dependent on significant slave labor for their operation and maintenance. Fact 81. Roman military engineers were as important as fighting soldiers, building the infrastructure that allowed armies to campaign successfully. Bridges, siege works, fortified camps, roads, and permanent frontier fortifications. When Caesar besieged Alesia in Gaul, his engineers constructed elaborate circumvallation and contravallation lines, double walls of fortifications facing both inward to contain the besieged and outward to defend against Gallic relief forces, complete with ditches, palisades, towers, and obstacles. This engineering feat, completed in weeks by legionaries who were expected to be proficient in construction as well as combat, allowed Caesar to hold position against forces that vastly outnumbered his own. Similarly, at Masada, Roman engineers built a massive siege ramp up a mountainside, hauling thousands of tons of earth and stone to create an inclined approach for siege towers and battering rams. The legionaries' entrenching tool and saw were as essential as his gladius. This engineering capacity gave Roman armies enormous advantages. They could cross rivers, reduce fortifications, establish supply lines, and create strong defensive positions almost anywhere. The skills learned in military service transferred to civilian projects. Veteran soldiers became engineers, surveyors, and construction supervisors in civilian life, spreading Roman building techniques throughout the empire. The military's engineering works permanently marked landscapes. You can still walk along Hadrian's Wall, stand on Roman bridges, and trace the lines of siege works at Masada, physical testimony to Roman engineering's durability and the military's dual nature as both destroyer and builder. Let the empire's builders rest now in your imagination. The walls they raised, the bridges they threw across rivers, the camps they dug and fortified, all this effort, all this skill, applied over centuries, shaping landscapes that endure still. Breathe easily, and let these human efforts, so distant yet so present, accompany you toward whatever rest you seek. Fact 82. Roman naming conventions reflected social structure and family identity through a three-part name system for male citizens: the praenomen, personal name; nomen, clan name; and cognomen, family branch name. So that Marcus Tullius Cicero identified himself as Marcus, of the Tullian clan, of the Cicero family within that clan. Praenomina were limited, perhaps 15 in common use, and often abbreviated M. For Marcus, C. For Gaius, L. For Lucius. The nomen indicated which gens or clan you belonged to. a group theoretically descended from common ancestor and sharing religious obligations. The cognomen distinguished different families within large clans and sometimes originated in nicknames. Cicero supposedly from Cicer, chickpea, perhaps referencing an ancestor with a chickpea-shaped wart. Additional cognomina might be added for distinction or to commemorate achievements. Women took the feminine form of their father's nomen, Tullia for a woman of the Tullian clan, sometimes with a number if there were multiple daughters, but typically without prenomen or cognomen, suggesting their identity was subsumed into male lineages. Freed slaves took their former master's prenomen and nomen, adding their slave name as cognomen, marking their freed status while showing their connection to their patron. Names carried information about citizenship, status, family, and sometimes character or achievements. The Roman name was thus far more than simple identification. It was a compressed resume of identity, relationships, and social position, read instantly by those familiar with the system. Fact 83. The Roman Senate House, the Curia Julia, rebuilt by Julius Caesar and completed by Augustus, still stands in Rome's Forum. Its brick facade weathered but intact, its bronze doors medieval replacements for originals moved to the Lateran Basilica. Inside, the rectangular chamber once held 300 senators on stepped benches along the two long walls, facing each other across the central aisle where speakers addressed the assembly. The presiding consul or emperor sat at the far end. There was no voting mechanism beyond senators moving to one side or the other, or shouting approval or disapproval. Debates could be lengthy, speakers unlimited in time. Cato the Younger famously filibustered by talking until nightfall when the Senate had to adjourn. The Senate's actual power declined under the emperors, becoming advisory and ceremonial, yet it retained symbolic importance as representing traditional republican governance and the collective wisdom of Rome's elite. Senators still debated provincial governance, ratified treaties, voted honors to the emperor, and provided a trained pool of administrators for the empire. The institution's persistence long after it lost real power testifies to the importance Romans placed on maintaining forms and continuities, on pretending the republic continued even under autocracy. The Curia's survival is somewhat accidental. Converted to a church in the 7th century, it was protected from demolition and spoliation, and though restored multiple times, retains its ancient structure. Walking inside, standing where senators once stood, you occupy the same physical space where the fate of the ancient world was debated, though in what must now be profound silence compared to the contentious voices that once filled this chamber. Fact 84. Roman adoption of Greek philosophy, particularly Stoicism and Epicureanism, profoundly influenced elite culture and provided ethical frameworks for navigating power, wealth, and responsibility. Stoicism, with its emphasis on virtue, duty, self-control, and accepting fate's inevitable decrees, appealed especially to the senatorial class. Stoics believed in living according to nature and reason, distinguishing between what's within our control, our judgments, reactions, intentions, and what isn't, external events, others' actions, death. This philosophy offered tools for maintaining equanimity amid political turmoil, personal loss, and the corrupting temptations of power. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, embodied the Stoic ideal of duty over inclination. Epicureanism, often misunderstood as advocating hedonism, actually taught that happiness comes from simple pleasures, friendship, and freedom from fear, particularly fear of gods and death. Epicureans sought ataraxia, tranquility, through moderate living and philosophical reflection. These philosophies weren't academic abstractions but practical guides for living. Elite Romans employed philosophers as household tutors and advisors. Philosophical schools in Athens and Rome taught young men heading for political careers. Philosophical precepts appeared in letters, speeches, and literature. This embrace of Greek philosophy represented Rome's cultural sophistication, their willingness to learn from conquered peoples, and their need for intellectual frameworks more developed than traditional Roman religion provided for addressing life's deepest questions. Fact 85. The Roman chariot, while familiar from races, also served practical purposes. Transportation for the wealthy, ceremonial vehicles for triumphs, and war chariots, though these were obsolete by imperial times. Racing chariots were highly specialized, lightweight frames of bent wood, reinforced at critical points, with small platforms where charioteers stood, controlling horses with reins wrapped around their bodies. The danger was enormous. Crashes, called naufragia or shipwrecks, happened frequently, chariots overturning or colliding at high speed, horses tangling, drivers dragged unless they cut themselves free quickly. Yet the glory and rewards for successful charioteers were substantial. Some became enormously wealthy, celebrated celebrities whose fans followed their careers passionately. The four racing factions, blues, greens, reds, whites, inspired fierce loyalty that transcended the races themselves, becoming vehicles for expressing broader social and political allegiances. Riots between factions weren't uncommon, the most famous being Constantinople's Nika riots in 532 CE during Justinian's reign, when chariot faction violence escalated into an uprising that nearly toppled the emperor and burned half the city. That athletic entertainment could generate such passionate intensity seems strange to modern sensibilities. But for Romans, the circus was one of few venues where the populace gathered en masse, where collective emotions found expression, where the distance between rulers and ruled temporarily diminished, making races about much more than horses running fast around tracks. Fact 86. Roman military tactics emphasized discipline, organization, and flexibility over individual heroism. The basic unit, the century of 80 men, could operate independently or combine with others in complex maneuvers. The legion's standard formation was the triplex acies, 3 lines of cohorts, the front line of less experienced men, the second line of prime troops, and third line of veterans as reserve. This allowed fresh troops to replace tired ones, or the reserve to exploit breakthroughs or shore up threatened positions. Legions also employed specialized troops, cavalry for scouting and flank attacks, auxiliary infantry recruited from provinces and fighting in their native styles, skirmishers with javelins and slings. Training drilled soldiers in marching in formation, maintaining lines under pressure, executing commands instantly. Roman military success came not from superior weaponry or individual soldier quality, but from training, discipline, and commanders who understood how to employ these organized forces tactically. Against less organized opponents, even superior numbers often couldn't overcome Roman cohesion. The defeat of Roman forces when it occurred usually resulted from terrain negating tactical advantages, as in the Teutoburg forest where Germanic tribes ambushed Varus's legions in forests where Roman formations couldn't deploy properly, or from commanders' errors, or from facing opponents who had learned Roman tactics and could counter them. But through most of Rome's expansion, the legion's combination of heavy infantry, engineering capability, and disciplined execution proved nearly unstoppable. Fact 87. The Roman aqueduct system represented one of the empire's greatest infrastructure achievements, with Rome itself eventually supplied by 11 separate aqueducts totaling over 250 miles, mostly underground but rising on magnificent arcades where geography required. The water flowed constantly, regulated by settling tanks, distributed through lead pipes to public fountains, bathhouses, and some private homes, though private connections required imperial permission and payment. The Romans understood gravity but not pressure. They couldn't pressurize pipes to push water uphill, so aqueducts maintained continuous gentle downslope from source to destination, sometimes requiring long detours around obstacles to maintain proper gradient. Engineers achieved remarkable precision. The Aqua Virgo, rebuilt as Rome's Trevi fountain outlet, descends just 60 feet over its 14-mile length, an average grade of about 0.4%. This required careful surveying using groma and chorobates, instruments that allowed measuring level and slope with impressive accuracy. Aqueducts rarely suffered serious interruption, though sieges occasionally involved cutting water supplies, and routine maintenance required inspecting channels, clearing mineral deposits, and repairing leaks. Cities throughout the empire built similar systems. Segovia's aqueduct in Spain, still carrying water until recent times. Nîmes Pont du Gard in France. Countless others, many still standing though no longer functional. Clean water, abundantly supplied, free at public fountains, was perhaps Rome's most tangible gift to its cities, enabling urban density and public health impossible without reliable water sources. Fact 88. Roman literary culture produced works that defined Western literature for centuries. Virgil's Aeneid, Ovid's Metamorphoses, Horace's Odes, Cicero's speeches and philosophical dialogues, Tacitus's histories, Juvenal's satires. These weren't produced in isolation but emerged from sophisticated literary culture where authors competed for patronage, read their works at public and private recitations, and engaged in critical dialogue with tradition and contemporaries. The Aeneid, commissioned essentially by Augustus to provide Rome with a foundation myth linking it to Troy and celebrating Augustan peace after civil war, became immediately canonical, studied in schools, quoted constantly, providing Romans with shared cultural reference points. Literature for elite Romans was both entertainment and moral instruction, demonstrating proper values and eloquence while exploring human nature and historical meaning. Books, in the form of scrolls written on papyrus or later parchment, were expensive and relatively scarce, creating a culture where literature was often experienced orally, read aloud, recited, performed. Wealthy men maintained libraries as status symbols and intellectual resources. The fire that destroyed Alexandria's great library was mourned as catastrophic loss. Roman literature built on Greek models while developing distinctive Latin voice. Virgil consciously emulated Homer while creating something new. Horace adapted Greek lyric forms to Latin, and satire was claimed by Romans as their own invention. This literary achievement survived Rome's political collapse, preserved first in Byzantine libraries, later by medieval monasteries, eventually becoming foundational texts for European Renaissance and modern Western education. Fact 89. Roman medical knowledge included understanding of basic anatomy, though hampered by prohibitions against human dissection and reliance on animal models that led to significant errors. Galen, the most influential physician, described organs and systems based primarily on monkeys and pigs, producing sophisticated anatomical theory that was nevertheless incorrect in important details. He thought blood was produced in the liver and consumed by the body rather than circulating, a misunderstanding that persisted for 14 centuries. Yet Roman doctors achieved real insights. They understood that the brain controlled the body, recognized that arteries and veins were distinct systems, distinguished motor and sensory nerves. Practical medicine focused on maintaining health through the four humors balance, believing disease resulted from humoral imbalance correctable through diet, exercise, bloodletting, or drugs. Diagnosis involved examining pulse, urine, temperature, and symptoms. Prognosis was important. Doctors wanted to know if a patient would recover or die, partly to protect their reputation by refusing hopeless cases. The best physicians combined observation, accumulated experience, philosophical theory, and genuine care for patients. The worst were quacks and charlatans. Medical ethics, codified in the Hippocratic Oath originating in Greek medicine but adopted by Roman doctors, emphasized doing no harm, protecting patient confidentiality, and refusing to perform euthanasia or abortion, though these practices continued regardless. Roman medicine's limitations were enormous by modern standards, yet within those limits, the best practitioners achieved what was possible with their knowledge, easing suffering and sometimes achieving cures through rest, nutrition, and times healing rather than direct intervention. Let medical knowledge and literary achievement, engineering and military discipline, all the empire's accumulated wisdom and skill, float gently through your consciousness. These Romans, so distant yet so familiar, faced life with the tools they had, achieved what they could, and left us fragments to wonder at. Fact 90. The Roman festival of Saturnalia in mid-December inverted normal social hierarchies in ways that must have been both exhilarating and unsettling. During these days, slaves could speak freely to masters, even mock them without punishment. Masters served slaves at banquets, a reversal of ordinary dining arrangements. Gambling, normally restricted or frowned upon, was permitted. People exchanged gifts, wax candles symbolizing light's return, small clay figurines called sigillaria. The atmosphere was carnivalesque, rules temporarily suspended, normal proprieties abandoned. This controlled chaos served multiple functions. It honored Saturn, ancient agricultural god associated with a mythical golden age of equality and abundance. It provided psychological release, allowing expression of social tensions in contained, temporary form, and it reinforced normal hierarchy by demonstrating its opposite, making regular subordination more acceptable by showing it wasn't absolute or eternal. After Saturnalia ended, normal order resumed, perhaps refreshed by the brief holiday from hierarchy. When Christianity replaced traditional religion, Saturnalia's elements migrated to Christmas celebrations. Gift-giving, feasting, temporary suspension of ordinary routines, showing how cultural practices persist through religious transition, too deeply embedded in popular consciousness to simply disappear even when their theological justification changes. Fact 91. Roman military medicine, as evidenced by archaeological finds at fortress sites, included surprisingly sophisticated hospital facilities. The valetudinarium at housesteads on Hadrian's wall had small individual rooms rather than open wards, suggesting isolation of different cases or concern for privacy and quiet during recovery. Medical instruments found at military sites show specialized surgical tools, suggesting that military surgeons performed complex procedures. The Roman army understood that healthy soldiers were effective soldiers, and that treating injuries and illnesses quickly improved recovery rates and maintained force strength. Military doctors held ranks and received pay higher than ordinary legionaries, reflecting their value. The army also maintained hygiene standards: latrines with running water, bathhouses for regular cleaning, requirements for clean water sources when establishing camps. These practices weren't based on germ theory, which wasn't understood, but on empirical observation that cleanliness correlated with health. The Roman army's health outcomes, while terrible by modern standards, were probably better than any other ancient military forces, giving Rome yet another advantage in sustained campaigning. The veterans who retired after 25 years of service had survived not just combat but disease, accidents, harsh climates, and the general health hazards of ancient life. They were the survivors, the tough and lucky, and when they retired to civilian life they brought their experience, their pensions, and often their health problems to veteran colonies where they became civilians and fathers, spreading Roman culture to frontier regions. Fact 92. Roman interior decoration reached remarkable sophistication in wealthy homes, with frescoed walls creating illusionistic architectural vistas, gardens, mythological scenes, or theatrical masks. The four Pompeian styles of wall painting, identified by modern archaeologists, show evolution from simple imitation of marble veneers to complex architectural fantasies, from miniaturist detail to bold impressionistic effects. The second style created illusionistic architecture with columns, porticos, and views through imaginary windows into painted gardens or cityscapes, expanding small rooms visually into grand spaces. The fourth style combined architectural elements with mythological panels, decorative details, and playful fantasy. These weren't mere decoration but expressions of culture, taste, education. A room painted with scenes from Homer signaled the owner's paideia, his Greek cultural education and sophistication. Some paintings show remarkable psychological insight. A portrait from Pompeii of a young woman holding stylus and wax tablet, looking directly at viewer with intelligent, confident gaze, captures personality across 2 millennia. Roman paintings haven't survived well. Exposure to light and air destroys them, so most are known only from Pompeii and Herculaneum, where volcanic burial protected them. We've lost perhaps 99% of Roman painting, meaning we're judging their artistic achievement on a tiny, possibly unrepresentative sample. Still, what survives shows technical mastery, aesthetic sophistication, and visual sensibilities that feel surprisingly modern. Fact 93. The Roman grain trade, essential to feeding the empire's cities, required massive organization. Grain grown in Egypt's Nile Valley, harvested by peasant farmers who paid it as tax, stored in granaries at Alexandria, loaded onto massive ships for transport to Portus, transferred to barges for journey up Tiber to Rome, stored again in massive urban warehouses, eventually distributed to recipients of the annona or sold in markets. Each step required coordination, supervision, record-keeping. The system was vulnerable to disruption, whether delaying ships, pirates capturing vessels, peasant revolts reducing harvests, civil war interrupting supply chains. When grain supplies ran short, Rome faced potential riot and starvation. Emperors took personal responsibility for ensuring grain supply, sometimes financing shipments themselves or offering rewards to ship owners who delivered during dangerous winter sailing season. The grain fleet from Alexandria was watched for anxiously each sailing season, its arrival celebrated. This dependence on imported food gave Egypt enormous strategic importance. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled Rome's food supply and thus political stability. Augustus made Egypt an imperial possession rather than a senatorial province, recognizing its special importance and keeping it under direct control. The Roman grain trade represented ancient globalization's apex, a system of intercontinental supply chains supporting urban populations far from their food sources, sophisticated and fragile simultaneously, remarkable achievement and fundamental vulnerability. Fact 94. Roman clothing beyond the formal toga included the tunic, the practical everyday garment for men and women, typically made of wool or linen, short-sleeved or sleeveless, reaching to knees for men and ankles for women. Workers wore short, practical tunics. Aristocrats wore longer, finer tunics of quality fabric, sometimes with decorative stripes indicating status. Women wore a stola, a long dress, over their tunic, and a palla, a draped shawl, when going outside. Clothing was expensive. Most people owned only a few garments, which they wore until threadbare and patched repeatedly before discarding. The wealthy displayed status through fabric quality, dyes, and quantity rather than elaborate cutting or tailoring. Purple dye, extracted from murex shellfish at enormous cost, was restricted to elite use, with full purple garments reserved for emperors and victorious generals. Textiles were produced primarily in household contexts, women spinning wool or flax into thread, weaving thread into cloth on looms, processes requiring skill and consuming significant time. Wool was most common fabric, linen was more expensive, silk, imported from China, was luxury beyond most people's reach. Cotton from India was known but uncommon. Clothing styles changed slowly. We can recognize a Roman from any era by their draped garments, unlike modern fashion's rapid turnover. Yet even within Roman period, subtle changes occurred in draping styles, fabric preferences, color fashions, though these are difficult to track without extensive written or pictorial evidence. Fact 95. Roman military retirement after 25 years of service included a discharge bonus called the premia militiae, originally land grants that settled veterans in colonies throughout the empire, later sometimes commuted to cash payments. This system served multiple purposes. It rewarded loyalty and provided for soldiers' old age. It Romanized frontier regions by planting Latin-speaking veterans in them, and it alleviated urban unemployment by removing veterans from cities to agricultural land. Veteran colonies became agents of cultural transformation. Veterans married local women, raised families, maintained Roman customs and language, built Roman-style towns with forums and baths. Their colonies often became important cities: Turin, Cologne, Zaragoza, Lyon, many more. Veterans organized themselves into collegia, associations that provided social connection, maintained military identity, and sometimes served as political bloc. Some veterans prospered, becoming local magistrates or wealthy landowners. Others struggled, especially if they received poor land or lacked agricultural skills. Some re-enlisted or joined auxiliary units for additional service. The veteran population represented significant military reserve. In emergencies, experienced former soldiers could be recalled. The system also created powerful emotional ties between army and emperor. Soldiers knew their retirement depended on completing service and receiving promised benefits, making them invested in empire stability and their commander's success. When emperors failed to pay promised bonuses, military revolts might follow, demonstrating how much imperial stability depended on keeping faith with legions. Fact 96. The Roman postal system's messengers, the cursors, traveled in relay, carrying dispatches along the empire's roads in an ancient version of the Pony Express. A messenger might ride one horse hard to the next post station, change to a fresh mount, continue immediately, allowing dispatches to cover 50 miles per day or more with urgent messages traveling even faster. This system required maintaining hundreds of post stations, each with horses, staff, food, and lodging for official travelers. The cursus publicus existed for government business, but its infrastructure benefited private travel too. Roads built for military and postal use served merchants and pilgrims, and posting stations sometimes offered services to paying private travelers. The system represented major investment and ongoing expense, justified by need to coordinate administration and military across vast distances. Without rapid communication, provincial governors would operate too independently, military threats wouldn't be reported promptly, tax revenues wouldn't flow efficiently to central government. The postal system made empire manageable, converting geographical distances into time distances short enough that central authority could maintain control. Modern scholars sometimes compare Roman communications to modern internet in relative terms. While absolutely slow, the cursus publicus provided Romans with communication speed unprecedented in ancient world, enabling coordination and control that gave them enormous advantages over less organized neighbors. Fact 97. Roman engineering extended to mining operations that showed remarkable sophistication, the use of water power for crushing or enwashing gold, complex drainage systems using water wheels to remove water from deep mines, extensive surveying to follow or veins underground. At Rio Tinto in Spain, Roman mining operations transformed the landscape with open-cast workings, added tunnels, and the remains of massive water wheel systems for drainage. Miners worked in dangerous conditions, the work assigned often to slaves or condemned prisoners for whom it was essentially a death sentence. Yet free miners worked too, earning wages and sometimes contracting operations. Mining produced the metals essential to Roman economy: gold and silver for coinage, iron for tools and weapons, tin and copper for bronze, lead for water pipes and construction. The environmental impact was severe: deforestation to fuel smelting furnaces, toxic runoff from mining operations, destroyed landscapes. Romans had no concept of environmental conservation or sustainability. Resources existed to be exploited for immediate benefit. The mining regions became scarred landscapes, their agricultural potential destroyed but their metallic wealth enriching empire. Modern archaeologists study ancient mining sites to understand Roman engineering techniques and economic priorities, and sometimes struggle with contamination from Roman operations still affecting environments 2,000 years later. Fact 98. Roman music, largely lost to us since musical notation wasn't developed, played important roles in religious ritual, military signaling, theatrical performances, and entertainment. We know instruments from artworks and archaeological finds: the tibia, a double reed instrument like an oboe; the lyre and kithara, stringed instruments associated with Apollo and poetry; the tuba and cornu, brass horns used by military; panpipes, drums, cymbals, and bells. Professional musicians, often slaves or freedmen, performed at banquets, games, religious ceremonies. Music accompanied theatrical performances and gladiatorial combats. The military used trumpet calls to signal commands: advance, retreat, change formation. Few Roman musical fragments survive, and those that do use notation we can only approximately interpret. We don't know what Roman music sounded like with any certainty, one of the most frustrating losses in reconstructing ancient culture. Literary descriptions mention music's emotional effects, particular instruments' associations with certain moods or gods, debates about music's proper role in society, concerns that certain musical modes promoted moral corruption. These debates echo Greek philosophical discussions of music's ethical and political effects. Roman elite had mixed feelings about music, appreciating it as cultural refinement but suspicious of professional performers, especially those from Greek East, as morally dubious. Yet music permeated Roman life from lullabies to funeral dirges, from victory celebrations to religious hymns, a constant soundtrack now reduced to silence, leaving us only instruments without their voices and descriptions without their sounds. Fact 99. Roman attitudes toward death and afterlife mixed official state religion, popular superstition, philosophical speculation, and mystery cult promises. Official religion offered little comfort. The dead descended to shadowy underworld, continuing in diminished existence without much personality or hope. This bleak afterlife made funeral rites and commemoration crucial. The living could honor the dead with regular offerings and remember their names, preventing complete obliteration. Tombstones often addressed passers-by, asking to be remembered. "Stranger, my message is short. Stop and read it through. Here is the unlovely tomb of a lovely woman." Some people turn to mystery religions offering better afterlife prospects. Bakshik mysteries, Isis cult, eventually Christianity, all promising initiates special posthumous status. Philosophers offered different consolations. Epicureans taught death was annihilation, nothing to fear since you won't exist to experience it. Stoics emphasized living virtuously and accepting mortality as natural. Elite Romans often expressed skeptical agnosticism about afterlife, doubting immortality but hedging their bets with proper rituals. Common people perhaps believed more strongly in ghosts, spirits, and afterlife judgments. This diversity of beliefs coexisted without creating major conflicts until Christianity's rise. Christianity's promise of bodily resurrection and eternal life, its claim of certain knowledge about afterlife based on divine revelation, offered something dramatically different from traditional vagueness and philosophical speculation. This appeal partly explains Christianity's success. In face of death's universal challenge, it offered definite hope backed by powerful narrative of divine sacrifice and resurrection, more emotionally satisfying than philosophy's resignation or mystery cult's esoteric symbols. Fact 100. The fall of Rome's Western Empire occurred gradually over the 5th century CE, not in single catastrophic moment. Traditional date of 476 CE, when Germanic leader Odoacer deposed last Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus, represents administrative formality more than fundamental break. The Eastern Empire, what we call Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years. In the West, Roman institutions and culture didn't vanish but transformed, blending with Germanic successor kingdoms. Bishops took over many administrative functions as secular government weakened. Latin evolved into Romance languages. Roman law influenced Germanic codes. Christian church preserved literacy and learning through monastery scriptoria where monks copied manuscripts. The classical heritage survived in fragmentary, transformed state. What ended wasn't civilization itself, but the political structure of unified Western Empire under single emperor. The causes were complex. Military pressures from Germanic migrations, economic problems including currency debasement and trade disruption, plague reducing population, civil wars weakening central authority, increasing localization as provinces became self-sufficient. Christianity is sometimes blamed for weakening martial values, but Christian Byzantium survived. Perhaps most fundamental was that the Western Empire became too expensive to maintain. The military needed to defend vast frontiers cost more than the tax system could sustainably collect, creating fiscal crisis that made government increasingly ineffective. When Germanic peoples established kingdoms on former Roman territory, they maintained what Roman structures they could. They wanted Roman civilization's benefits even as they created something new. The end of Rome was thus more transformation than destruction, more gradual dissolution than catastrophic collapse, though for those living through the changes, watching cities shrink, roads deteriorate, security decline, literacy decrease, it must have felt like the world ending. And now, dear traveler, our journey through 100 facts about the Roman Empire comes to rest. You've walked with emperors and slaves, stood in the Forum's heart and on Hadrian's distant wall, sailed grain ships and built aqueducts, lived and died in the shadow of the Colosseum. The empire was vast, in space, spanning 3 continents. In time, lasting over 1,000 years in the east, 5 centuries in the west. In complexity, encompassing millions of lives, countless stories, achievements and horrors beyond our full comprehension. What remains now is for you to rest. The empire rose from 7 hills and spread across the known world, then fragmented and transformed, leaving ruins and memories, languages and laws, roads still traveled and aqueducts still standing. Its people, the farmers and senators, soldiers and slaves, mothers and merchants, lived their lives as fully as we live ours, loving and grieving, building and destroying, hoping and fearing. They're gone now, dust and shadow, but they were here. They existed. They mattered. Let that knowledge comfort you as you drift toward sleep. You're part of the same human story, connected across the centuries by shared experiences of joy and sorrow, by the simple fact of being alive and conscious in this mysterious universe. The Romans sleep now in their tombs, beneath Italian soil and African sand, under the stones of Britain and the dust of Syria. Sleep joins you to them, that universal human necessity, the daily death and resurrection we all experience. Close your eyes now, if they're not closed already. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let the empire's grandeur and complexity fade into comfortable darkness. You've heard the story. You've taken the journey. Now rest, peaceful and complete, held safely by the present moment while the past whispers its eternal lullaby. Good night, traveler. Sleep well. The Roman Empire, like all empires, all civilizations, all human endeavors, rose and fell, but the stars that shone on Roman nights still shine on ours. May they watch over your sleep as gently as they watched over Caesar's legions and Augustus's Rome, over Hadrian's wall and Constantine's city, over all the countless souls who came before and all who will come after. Rest now. Simply rest. Good night.